Good afternoon. Please take your seats. No, but we have some women panels.
No, he's specific about Los Angeles.
Just your normal anti-California.
Why not, right? It's not so much the best part, it's the California part.
Right. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Okay, take your seats, please. We all set? We are now going to learn how to fix the housing crisis. I'm pleased to introduce our next panel, Michael Weinstein from the AIDS Healthcare and Healthy Housing Foundations, Alex Lee, a California Assemblyman, and our own Michael Monti from Champlain Housing Trust, who's Michael is also a college buddy of mine, so we stay in touch. But this is quite an interesting panel. Alex and Michael came all the way from California. We began the housing discussion out there, and it was incredible, and we felt that they needed to talk here as well. And everybody knows the incredible job that Michael is doing at Champlain Housing Trust. So please welcome our panel.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. One of these mics is going to work. Thank you, Jane, so much for setting a stage for us. Today, I'm just going to briefly set the stage for this conversation we're having. I know this is only one of two housing conversations that are focused here at this gathering, but last time when the gathering happened in Los Angeles, which I was very fortunate to be part of, the whole thing was about housing, and I really do think that housing is becoming a great national crisis, not just in California. I've heard from Vermonters here that single bedrooms can cost $1,500 a month here, and I'm like, that's almost California prices now. So whenever I go to somewhere and I see California prices, you definitely are catching up to us in the crisis. For a long time, we have thought for California as the epicenter of the housing crisis, but the same issues are now playing out across the nation. And I believe that there's a lot of solutions in California that we can also learn from, but also learn from other places in the country into how to fix the housing crisis. So today we're going to have a panel to discussion. We're going to be pretty succinct in our remarks because we do want to have some discussion with the rest of the group and talk about housing policy, and we can be as nuanced or high level as possible. But I'll just quickly say and introduce myself as that my name is Alex Lee. I'm the California State Assembly member for the 24th Assembly District, which is in the Bay Area. I'm the chair of the Legislative Progressive Caucus and also chair of Human Services Committee, but also chair of the Select Committee on Social Housing, which is what the big presentation I did last time, which is about getting the public sector to develop affordable housing ourselves and not rely on the private sector. And I'll get out of the way is that my district that I represent is 500,000 people in my area, and that's 5 cities, 2 counties, and I understand that's a bit of a scale difference in Vermont, but it is still the same principles at play here. Not to say that, in California, we also have our own California bubble of California exceptionalism, and we love it to hear when we have shout outs about what we're doing great and all that stuff, but also we sometimes have our blind spots. We don't often see, like how I've also remarked and seen is that under Mayor Bernie's time, you passed a lot of policies 40 years ago that we're still struggling with our own governor to pass right now, especially when it comes to renters. So I really am pleased today to be joining you all today about what models, what discussions we can have, and we can learn about how to solve the housing crisis. And now I'll ask Michael Weinstein to introduce yourself and talk about some of the important work you're doing, and then Michael Monti as well after that.
Hello, I'm Michael Weinstein, the president of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and also the Housing as a Human Right. And we started as the AIDS Hospice Foundation, so we were providing not just healthcare, but housing at that time. And we've gotten back into housing because I'm motivated by the same outrage that I felt of people dying in the hallways of the county hospital in the 80s that I feel now about in the 5th largest economy in the world and one of the richest cities in creation, that we are the homeless capital, not just of the United States, but of the world, because I travel extensively in the developing world. Just came back about 10 days ago from South Africa and Zambia. A month before that, I was in Brazil and Sao Paulo. And Nowhere I've been, anywhere in the world, have I seen as many people laying on the sidewalk, calling the sidewalk their home. Just very briefly, well, first of all, the whole issue of housing starts with the rent is too damn high.
That's right.
Okay. That's the root of the problem. Okay. And we can't let that go by. So there's an initiative on the ballot that we've qualified for November called Justice for Renters. You've seen it on the step and repeat. And that's to repeal a statewide ban on local rent control that the real estate industry imposed in the 80s and 90s, not just in California, but in 34 states across the union. So that's something we need to wipe out everywhere that it exists. In addition to that, we have bought and rehabbed hotel properties across the majority of them are in Los Angeles, but now across the country. And we are heavily promoting the idea of adaptive reuse. Building new buildings is necessary. Production is necessary. And I'll come back to that later. But the easiest and best way to get people housed as quickly as possible is to take existing buildings and rehab them to make them into homes. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Michael.
Well,
Go ahead, Michael.
thank you. So this is a difficult crowd to be with because most of them know too much about me or about Champlain Housing Trust. But all those who are CHT members, raise your hand. There are a few of them, yeah, great. So we are a membership-based, for those of you who are not, we are a membership-based organization established in the 1980s, in 1984, the result of a merger of two organizations, which basically promoted by then Mayor Sanders. The idea was permanent affordability, was shared equity home ownership, and was a way of fighting displacement and gentrification in Burlington's old North End. That key component of permanent affordability is the most important piece of everything we've done since the 1980s. The notion of creating housing and making sure that it always remained affordable to everyone forever has enabled Burlington to have a stock of affordable housing, and this region to have a stock of affordable housing, which simply does not disappear and is always there. I sent you a link to the Lincoln Institute, which is there's a great little clip, 20-minute clip. Bernie's in it. I think I'm in it. Brenda's in it. And in it, it talks about It's Still the One, which is the old North End. It's a very cool video. And it tells a story. It tells a story of the history of the importance of what we tried to do. There are people, so many people here who were a part of this. So my apologies to Brenda and Gary and Peter Clavell and everyone else who was here to do this. But the three things we talked about is preservation, production, and protection. Those three Ps, critical, right? Preservation of existing affordable housing, things like Northgate, saving Northgate, making sure that the existing housing that was there was always going to be there for people, protecting tenants on a range of levels. And we did everything, we tried everything, and some things were successful, but everything from rent control to just cause eviction to condo replacement ordinances, housing replacement, a whole range of things. Ordinances that are now in our books in Vermont, in Burlington, and have gone up to the state of Vermont at times as well. And again, producing affordable housing, because the important thing is the rent is too damn high. You need more affordable housing stock. And that's what CHT does. So we have promoted on shared equity home ownership. Can I go on? But as we focus on shared equity home ownership as the key component of what we've done, we have transformed ourselves into looking at housing as a continuum, looking at everything from homelessness to home ownership and everything in between. So we now have 500 people who are formerly homeless living in our housing. We run 2 shelters, a motel and a pod community. We actually have 3 or 4 other buildings which we have built and developed on behalf of other folks who are providing homeless services. We have taken 11 motels and hotels and converted them over the last 12 years, starting with the small ones to now some larger ones over time, as an efficient and quick way of getting people housed. But we still do affordable rental. We still do home ownership. We still do counseling and education. And we have morphed into 5 different loan programs. And I want to go back to farm worker housing is one, mobile home lending is another. A third is assistance to people of color as down payment assistance for a shared equity program. And the other thing we have done also is we have merged and done community facilities. So even as we do housing, we feel like it's important to make sure that the community has the community facilities it needs in order to grow and prosper. So I won't start doing more than that, but right now Champlain Housing Trust works both on a regional level. We do some programs statewide. We do a lot of conversations on a national level. I'm going to Seattle next week and then Denver after that to talk with other nationalist groups who are promoting and pushing for affordable housing solutions at a state and national level. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. So I particularly find that very illuminating because you share the stage with 2 other Californians who don't know very much about it. In fact, when I got here, I was like, why is it called Champlain Lake Housing Authority? I was like, wait, it's like, the town's not called Champlain. Champlain. So that's how much little we don't know in our California bubble. But just
as an explorer back in the...
exactly, yeah. So, but going back to Michael Weinstein, you know, so you've done a lot of work, obviously, for justice for renters, and many a time, although it's very difficult in California, to fight for basic tenant protections that Burlington actually achieved, like I said, 40, 50 years ago. And in California, just at this stage, nearly half the population, if not more, are renters. And yet, in our state legislature, there are only 5 out of 120 of us who are renters. I'm one of them. So only less than 5% of us are renters. In fact, there are
25% are landlords.
Yes, exactly. 25% of legislators are landlords. So while we own 0 homes, most of them own multiple homes. In fact, in my own district, which I still think is the epicenter of the housing crisis, my own zip code, and I got a special prize because I said it to the Association of Realtors conference, I got the exact number right, is that the average home price for a single family home right now sells for $1.6333 million right now. And I got it right on the money. And they're like, how did you know? It's because I stalk Zillow every month to look for a house maybe. But it's impossible, right? So I just wanted to ask you, Michael, why is it so important that we continue our fight for renters in the state politics in California, and if not nationally as well, even though there's so many odds against us constantly?
I'm going to, say at the risk of being challenged, it is the #1 bread and butter issue in this country right now. Okay, and we're talking about a national election and motivating young people. Okay, young people very typically are paying 50% or more of their income. Right, a young person is not thinking about getting sick. They're invincible. Right, they're thinking about every single month that day comes up where they have to write that check for the rent. I mean, in Los Angeles, if you are at a minimum wage job, right, it will cost you 100% of your wage for the average apartment. Okay, and also I'll just say this very frankly, because 5 years ago when I spoke here, I said that housing is not high enough on the progressive agenda. Okay, and it still isn't. It's come up a little, but not nearly enough. And I think that, as has been talked about last night, is our job as progressives is to do everything we can every day to make people's lives materially better. Right? And this is an area that we have to focus on. Also, we talk about big oil, we talk about big healthcare. Okay? Real estate is the largest industry in the world. Okay? And what's happened in particular in this country is that there's been an invasion of corporate real estate, buying up multifamily houses. I mean, it was so sickening, like in California, after the financial crisis, particularly in areas like Central Valley and other places. So people were foreclosed on who've been given these bad loans, right? Then companies like Blackstone came in, bought the house, and rented it back to the person who'd been foreclosed upon, right?
At a higher rate, yeah.
Yeah, well, at an exorbitant rent.
Yes.
So I don't think you can really exaggerate, the magnitude of the problem. And what is the essence of why? The essence of the reason is because we're treating housing as a commodity. We're not treating it as a necessity. We're not treating it as a right. Basically, it's whatever the market will bear. And I want to address what you said, which is really, really important, which is I understand, and everyone who's involved in housing justice understands that rent control is not the answer or the only answer, right? It stems the bleeding. The purpose of rent control is to keep people in their homes, number one. But number two is to sustain the supply of affordable housing. Mm-hmm. Almost everywhere now, even in places that had rent control, fairly strict rent control before, you now have a thing called vacancy decontrol, which means that every time somebody moves out, it goes up to the market rate. Mm-hmm. Every time that happens, the pool of affordable housing goes down, right? And that's catastrophic. We also have a law in California, which I believe happens in other places as well, where a landlord can take something off the market, turn it into a condo or a hotel, or they say they're going to move in, okay, and that person is out. That's tens of thousands of units. But the other two pieces are the preservation of community. First of all, people don't live, by bread alone. They don't live by just having an apartment. They live by having a community that nurtures them, right? And what's happening in so many cities is that we had white flight in the 70s. Now people are moving into the city, right, to avoid the commute or for whatever other reasons, right? So what are the areas that are being targeted? The close-in places, primarily people of color and poor communities, because that's where the land is cheaper, right? Okay. What you put on top of that is that, I recognize that it's popular to talk about zoning, right, and the issues with zoning, right? And the legislature, California legislature, is obsessed with it. Just dozens and dozens of bills, okay? But what mainly happens is that almost all the development is luxury. So somebody buys a piece of land that they can put 100 units on, and they get an exemption. Now they can put 300 units on. All of a sudden, that's better than printing money. That land overnight is worth 3 times as much. And virtually none of the communities we live in have what we call inclusionary zoning, meaning that they're required to have a percentage of units that are low income. And even when they have inclusionary zoning, every time you hear affordable housing, hold on to your wallet. Affordable housing goes up to 120 or even 140% of the area median income. I'm not saying you're rolling in dough or you have it great when you're making, in LA that would put you up to $120,000. I'm not saying you're rich making that kind of money, but you don't need the government's help necessarily. You can pay the $2,700, right? When we talk about low-income housing, we need to talk about the person on disability for $1,200 a month that they're getting, right? We need to talk about, the person in the minimum wage job. We need apartments that cost $600, right? Not $1,600. So, the other thing I want to say is, when we're looking at, one of the things that's harming the Democrats is inflation, right? And because people are feeling like they're, getting, less and less for the money they make. And by the way, I have to say that, overall, in many places, the increases in rent are outstripping what's being the wages and even what union wages are increasing by. So it's still a net negative for the majority of working class people who rent. But the so the issue really comes down to the fact that I was going to say about inflation finish that thought was that 60% of the inflation in the last year and a half has been housing, has been shelter. So you cannot have meaningful, long-term reduction in inflation without controlling the cost of housing. So, the politics and the need come together. So I hope, in making this appeal, I hope that, we have the creme de la creme of progressive America here. You know, I hope that you will go back and start thinking about, you know, how you can plug into it. And again, I mean, I'm so thrilled and honored that, that Bernie has come on board as an endorser of our Justice for Renters. We got the California Democratic Party endorsement, Maxine Waters, Dolores Huerta, I mean, a who's who of great people, but they're going to put $100 million against us. And we're ahead in the polls, but, you know, that's before the aerial bombardment happens, right? And so, you know, the safe money is, we've put this on the ballot twice before, the safe money is we'll lose. And that's why the only antidote to that is a movement from below, is a renters' revolution. Nothing short of that is ever, I mean, Sacramento is where renters' rights go to die. Every year, this repeal of this ban is introduced, okay? For 5 years, it couldn't even get a hearing. A couple of years ago, it got a hearing and died. This year, it got a hearing and was amended to take all the teeth out of it, okay, by the chair of the committee. And then when it went to the floor, that same chair voted against it. That's where we stand.
So sounds very optimistic in California, as you can tell, in our struggles. But the ironic truth of it is that as the housing crisis gets worse, and you have to learn from us because we are like the epicenter and gets worse and worse and worse exponentially every year, is that the truth of the political reality is as the material reality gets worse, that is why the polling is getting better on this. It's just that it's getting so insufferable that people, even if they were skeptical renters in the first place, start turning towards our solutions, which is ironically beneficial to our cause. Michael Monti, I wanted to talk to you about, you know, you've talked about the whole continuum of services and incredible stuff you've been pioneering for quite a while here and that we're trying to learn from. But, you know, obviously we still notice here in Vermont, in Burlington, that, see, I'm so used to saying in California. In Vermont, we still notice there's homelessness, there's still high rents. What do you think is missing out of the equation here? What kind of solutions or policies still need to be enacted here, even though you're so ahead of us in policy? What do you think is missing?
That's a great question. So that's my daily job, is to try to fully understand what to do next on this. The key part of anything around homelessness is to have affordable housing, and you just need more of it, and you need good rents to do that. I would say that our rents start at 60% of median income, and they go lower. So we never have those kinds of things. The policy in Vermont generally around affordable housing is permanent affordability and really meeting the needs of people who are homeless. We just need more resources to build more housing. Mr. Pichek is here. He has put some more money into the creation of more affordable housing. We had a bill in the House last year, and it was $100 million a year, which is significant money, not for you guys from California, but significant money for Vermont, to create affordable housing for the next 10 years, taxing the highest income people, just a couple of percentages to do that. And we showed if you did that, we were going to be able to build thousands of new units. For us, significant. It did well. It passed the House. It was significant. It was great. It went to the Senate. It got stuck in let's focus on zoning kind of thinking. It died. I think it'll come back. I actually think there is a conversation that could happen in the Senate this year. They looked at it. Some people looked at it afterwards, after it was over, and we say we'll need more money. The key part is money.
Financing.
It's really not more complicated than that. I wish it could be more complicated than that, but it's not more complicated than that. It's really how do you build more affordable housing? And you know, the way we've done it in the past decade, or especially 5 years, is do it as cheaply as possible. By our cost to build a motel unit is $180,000 as opposed to $600,000. But there's a range of things that we have to do. We have to build more. Interest rates have to go down. Vacancy rate has to go up. The market does have a role, you know, separate from that. But you can't say it's the market. It's really also the need for the creation of more affordable housing units. Vermont's has had an influx. We talked about this at lunch. Has had an influx of people from all over, including homeless folks, but including people with a lot of money buying up housing. Some guy in New York City buying 19 homes in some pastoral setting throughout the state, renting them out as Airbnbs from his place wherever he is in Manhattan. And that kind of stuff has been happening more and more and more, taking stuff off the market. So our home ownership prices are going up. $2,100 for one bedroom. That's the market rent.
It's horrible.
$2,400, $2,500 for a two bedroom, and that's in the median income. Much of the housing that's being built is 28, 3,000, 3,500. So the prices are way out of whack. And the cost of homes to build is 600,000. And that's why, you know, that's why we step in and try to create affordable home ownership, you know, create it more, bring more equity from other sources. Our homes sell for 175,000, and there's a shared equity in the context. People build wealth, the community retains wealth and holds on to the wealth for the next generation. We pay it forward. So we have 678 homes like that. We sold 30 homes last year just on the stock. We have agreements with Habitat. We have agreements with developers to do housing on our behalf. We have inclusionary zoning, and certainly in Burlington. I mean, there are people who have battled for all of these rules, IZ, and all these other rules in this room who sat out at City Council with I think it was Terry Barristas who said, when you did something that's radical in Burlington, you wore a tie and jacket. And if you wanted to do something that was really conservative, you came in with your jeans. That was the best political advice Terry ever gave to passing laws. But I think that has created, I think, a framework that has retained. If you go to the Old North End now, you will see lots of different people. A level of affordability doesn't exist in most communities, and sort of a stabilization of that neighborhood that is different than other places. If you go to the adjoining neighborhood, a city of Winooski, where it's not as strong as it should be, people are being displaced. People are being kicked out. Folks are fleeing the city because they can't afford it. That's something we're beginning to work on right now.
Absolutely, thank you. So, I mean, when you focus on one of the points that you talked about and how simple it may sound, is that a key to a big part of the housing crisis is financing. So a lot of legislatures and even the federal government now is talking about zoning. I think zoning has an important pivotal first step in it, and it's very easy for even bipartisan agreement to get to, because fundamentally it's about what can a private owner do with their property, right? If someone wants to tear down their house, turn it into a fourplex, why not? If someone wants to build an ADU in it, why not, right? Those are the kind of zoning conversations we have. It's just about changing how we use with land and how to be more smart with it. That's a base foundation. The second question that must follow as progressives is, once we have now enabled more land to be allowed for housing and affordable housing, who is the one to deliver on that mission, right? It should be on mission-driven nonprofits. It should be on the state or the government to do so. But increasingly, almost 99.9% of all development is done by the for-profit private sector, right? And so and why I want to go back to financing is important, is even though the housing crisis is so bad, even though the demand is so high, why is it then supply is so low? Is because two things, right? One, financing is really bad right now. Interest rates, all this stuff. So you are seeing private developers even scaling back their developments because it's much more profitable to sell $1 million condo than to rent out lots of smaller units of apartments, right? Just financial sense. And secondly, is there are a lot of actors out there that profit off of scarcity today. It is within their own business interest to have scarcity, to keep the price high. And that is the kind of greed you see in it, right? Because if market forces work perfectly, we just see a flood of supply, right? Because there's so many people who need a house and so many people who would pay a reasonable price for it, right? But you're not seeing that. And that's why financing is so important. And a financing idea that, if I can pitch to policymakers here, is two things. One is to embrace a revolving loan fund. Montgomery County in Maryland has really been embracing and doing this. Actually, in the video that you sent me, Michael, it describes actually our status quo system, basically our tax credit system, how we do affordable housing. Most of it, unfortunately, is the government throws money at the private sector, and they deliver some housing, and then the private sector pockets it, Wall Street most of the time, big banks. And then the affordable housing, those covenants expire after a certain amount of time, right? And there's lots of loopholes to do that. So they profit 2 times on that. But that is the status quo that we've existed since like the Reagan times, when they really vastly defunded public housing and all our tools do so. What we need to return to, and this is kind of the bridge version of a talk I did in the last session, is that we need to return to having the state be a strong actor in the provision of housing, just like we do with libraries and roads and schools, where no questions asked. You need to go to school, you need to go to work, you can drive on the road, right? And a kind of example about the 3 Ps we were talking about, why we need production, preservation, and protection, is that this system works well in a place that I always like to refer to in Austria and Vienna. For over 100 years, their government has been a vast producer of affordable housing, and that has enabled 60% of their community to live in social housing, 60% of a city of 2 million people, roughly, and it's worked for 100 years. And I want to say, as a political kind of vision and aspiration, is that the Viennese, the Social Democrats, in 1919, figured out to do a 1% income tax, basically, salary tax, to pay for all this stuff that's worked for 100 years. And it was part of their whole abundance as socialists to do a program of abundance and deliver. They delivered on childcare, nutrition, because literally people after World War I didn't even have enough food, and housing, and it was so bad. And I always use that example is because if a country that was just destroyed in World War I, when we defeated them, basically, it was so bad and they could reinvent themselves and provide for housing as a universal human right, then we as the most powerful nation in the human history could do that too. And so that leads me to our last kind of panel question, and then I'm gonna open up for a discussion with the group, is that I know tomorrow, Jane is actually be on this panel about how can we modernize our housing bureaucracy. So what would the advice you say for our federal partners? What more needs to be done at the federal level or even state level to get more affordable housing delivered for people?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it was great to hear President Biden in the State of the Union address talk about renters and talk about relief for renters. So that was great. I mean, when you think about social policy, it's about aligning incentives. So we wanted to support home ownership, right, in this country. And how do we do that? By giving people a huge tax break, right? And that has shifted the whole landscape so that people could and wanted to buy homes. We have to do a similar thing with the financing of low-income housing, right? Which is, first of all, the amount of federal and state money that goes to pure subsidy has to increase radically. And as part of the Build Back Better, there was a huge amount of money for that, which got lost in the shuffle. We need to treat, we have public utilities commissions in most of the states, right, which regulate utilities. Housing is a utility, as much as, gas or electricity or water, right? And therefore, the amount that rents can be raised, has to be limited and reviewed. One of the things that unfortunately, that some liberal Democrats have embraced is the trickle-down theory. The idea that whatever you build, it'll somehow alleviate the problem. But, it's like, it doesn't matter how many Ferraris you build if all you can afford is a Chevy. And the reality is, it's not one housing market, there's multiple housing markets. Because those people who build those speculative buildings, they're not going to lower the rent. They'd rather keep it empty and get a tax deduction than lower the rent. So there ought to be taxes on empty units in those buildings. Right? But any time that an exemption is given that allows you to build bigger, you should either have to include units or pay a hefty rebate to the government agencies so that they can use that money for that purpose. But, you think about what happens. I mean, if we have an earthquake, knock on wood, it doesn't happen. But I mean, or when FEMA goes, we treat it as an emergency. We're not treating the housing crisis right now as if it is an extreme humanitarian crisis. And if we did that, then I think the solutions would follow.
Well, I think Vermont has most of the policy right. And I think nobody gets a tax credit in Vermont, low-income housing tax credit, without the housing being permanently affordable. And without, if we're involved, us owning it outright after 15 years. And so we have a housing stock that is just permanently affordable, that is never going away. And I know there are other communities where it disappears in 15 years and people are profiting. That's crazy. That's a federal law that could change. Very significant, I think. But even adopted on a statewide basis, that could make a difference in lots of communities. I think more stable enabling legislation or even legislation on a local level for inclusionary zoning is critical. That's been valuable in the city of Burlington. I think a whole range of tenant protections need to be discussed again in many of the communities.
National rent control.
Yes, needs to be discussed again in terms of what we need to do to make sure that renters are simply not the vagaries of the market at this point. So
Absolutely.
you were right on everything. So
Thank you.
Very good. Well, I know we went over a lot of different terms in the housing world, and not everyone here is housing nerds like us. So I want to open up if there's
Half of
any
them are.
questions. I don't know how we should do this, but if there are any questions, please raise your hand over here. And if you could say your name, too.
So I'm Josh Farley. There's all this talk, it came out, I think it's in the paper today, yesterday, Vermont said that biggest increase.
Oh, 1 second. We're going to do a microphone because I know we're doing the live streaming. And so I'm tech conscious, so we want to make sure everyone can hear you. There you go.
Yeah. So it came out in the paper, I think, in the past couple of days, that Vermont said the biggest increase in housing prices in the country. You've been talking a lot about supply. I think the issue is really demand. So what we've seen, I talked to a lot of my students, and half the houses in their town have been purchased by outsiders. We did a study here, over 20% of the houses in Burlington don't have anybody living there, so they're purchased by somebody outside. And so what we see, we have a fixed amount of land, and you have people bidding for these homes who don't even live there, driving up the price. We have the second highest number of second homes and the second highest number of homeless people in the country. And is the problem that we don't have enough houses, or is the problem that we have too many people with enough money that they can buy second homes? And also these people who are now, right now, the average down payment on a house here is 60%, because we have high interest rates, so poor people can't afford it, but the big hedge funds, the people with these huge pools of money can just go in and buy it. So the interest rates actually would drive down prices a little bit, but the only people who can then afford it are those who have the money on hand. So I think the housing problem is overwhelmingly excess demand on the part of the rich. As soon as housing prices start to go up faster than the stock market, then the increased price attracts more demand, which drives up prices higher, setting a positive feedback loop. Homes have doubled in size. We have more housing space than we did 50 years ago, and more of a housing crisis. And so I really think people have to take seriously this idea that it is absolutely excess demand in the hands of the rich.
Can I ask a question? Many cities are forbidding or severely limiting Airbnb. Has that taken place here in Vermont?
I could
Yes.
talk to the-
yes. In Burlington, and there are people who really can talk to this. If you wanted to, Brian Pines back there could tell about the law. But yes, you just can't do an Airbnb. You have to be regulated. You have to live there. Secondly, it's being taxed. So our housing trust fund went from a couple few $100,000 to $1 million a year. That's a pretty significant dollar amount. If you did that in the state of Vermont, then, and I'm not suggesting that you simply let the existing vagaries of the market continue. I'm not suggesting that. But if they are going to be there, tax them, take the money, and build affordable housing. So that's at least a solution in terms of that's happening in Burlington. We're going to be able to build 70 units of housing at Cambrian Rise in a year or so, in part because that money is there.
There are states, though, also are talking about additional taxes on second and third homes.
Yeah. And let me just say, I can't remember which one of you talked about, but this notion of taking the 1 or 2% of the highest income people and taking that money and putting it in affordable housing, as you did in Vienna, that's what it was.
So did in Austria, yeah.
That's what we're talking about now in the legislature. That's what we talked about last year in the House. That's what we really need to get the Senate to pass. I don't know if it's going to get past the governor, but it's important that we try and do that. But that's essentially it. It's to build on what we've done already, because we've done well enough, not good enough still, but we've done well with what we've had, because it's all permanently affordable. We just now to create more of an income stream so that we could all create that social housing network.
Just one last point. There's more empty housing in California by far than there are people who are homeless.
All the homeless people in San Francisco could move into all of the second homes or an Airbnb.
Not even second home. I'm not even talking about second.
Airbnbs.
I'm talking about empty, high-end units. There's more of those than there are homeless people in California.
We have a question in the back there from Emily.
Oh, she's a house member of the House.
Our Vermont State.
That's Vermont State Rep.
Hi, Rep. Emily Krasnow, and I serve on the Committee General on Housing in the Vermont State House. And I'm really glad that you brought up the new statistic that we all saw recently about Vermont does not want to be the #1 in rising costs for real estate. Absolutely. I can say that. So as Michael mentioned, many municipalities are taking it step by step. We do have bills introduced in the last biennium, and we'll have more that are really looking at what's a second home, who's living in them, I introduced a bill this year, which is on the governor's desk, so hoping that goes through, that really tasks the Department of Housing to look at the data so that as policymakers next session, we have the real accurate data of our housing market, where we still have not been able to pass a statewide rental registry. This will show how we're doing in development, what our goals and targets are, if we're meeting them. So I think it'll be really helpful as policymakers that we have the accurate picture of what is going on in our housing market across the state. So I'm hopeful that we will see some progress in the next session and that we will bring back the wonderful bill that we worked so hard on in our committee and got through the House. So progress still to be made, but we did have some real accomplishments this year as well here in Vermont.
Awesome.
Hand over there.
There's a hand over there.
Hi, Chris Deacon. I'm curious on your opinions, and this is really for anybody, on the role that healthcare and specifically hospitals and health systems have in the affordable housing crisis. So Kaiser Permanente in California has committed to spending $400 million by 2030 on affordable housing units. Do you feel that this is part of the solution? Is this an efficient part of the solution, that they would, hospitals and health systems that receive a huge tax break are spending this money in that way?
Well, we're in a conundrum right now because cost of a new unit is about $700,000. So the problem is that they wouldn't build that many units. One of the things that has happened in California that's really very progressive is that Medi-Cal will help to pay a person, which is the Medicaid program in California, will help to pay a person's rent. And I think that's really an excellent idea. There's also a program in LA County to supplement people's rent and augment the services for people who are frequent users of the healthcare system.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously need every contributor possible to be funding affordable housing right now. And as Michael said, $400 million sounds like a lot, but in California, it drains up really quickly. But it is part of the corporate PR responsibility campaigns now is more and more of them feel the pressure to, especially in the tech companies, and a lot of those promises don't always come to fruition. But it is needed if they do realize their promise on it.
There was I'm going to say a legitimate moment in history in Burlington 7 or 8 years ago when the fellow who was the chief medical officer also worked in the emergency room and said all these people have no place to live. And he was able to create $6 million for us to build some housing. That was great. I'd rather have healthcare costs be more reasonable, frankly, right? But at the same point, there is a recognition from at least a local hospital, and they actually have contracts with us, put people up who are homeless, who are in the hospital because they have no place to go. They can't release somebody. It's cheaper for them to bring them to one of our places than it is for them to house inside the hospital. So there's definitely a connection. That's something that could be done. The hospital folks who we worked with are great. It's also, they're a $3 billion industry. I mean, here locally, this is a $3 billion company, and they're building their own housing right now for their own workers. That's what they're doing as part of their mission, which is great as well. So I have mixed feelings about it. It's a good thing to do, but.
Any other questions out there from our state treasurer up here?
State treasurer. You.
Well, Dave controls the mic,
waiting
I suppose. Dave has the real power.
He's Oprah.
No.
Hi, Mark Hughes, Executive Director of Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, and also with the Vermont Health Equity Advisory Commission, the co-chair. And I was just picking up on something that came from the other side of the room, because this is very much a health equity issue. All social determinants of health are so. I'd love to see our conversations as PROGs, and I just claimed it, yes. I just said, Brian Pine's in the room somewhere, you know what I'm talking about. So there is a need, I think, for us to kind of intersect these conversations, though. We've got to talk about housing in terms of, first of all, more than just a place to live, but, the entire spectrum of maybe even home ownership, land ownership. There's that. But then there's also, and I'm speaking in terms of equity, but then there's also education, employment, health services access, economic development, transportation. All of this stuff is intertwined, so to speak. They all got to be. We got to be. And so I'm just hoping that as we continue to have these conversations, that we get some of these other players at the table to be contributing to these discussions and being a part of these discussions, because it's incredibly important that we're doing this with a whole of government approach across the state, and that we're focusing on equity across the full spectrum of all social determinants of health, because the outcomes here are clearly inextricably bound. The other thing too is I wanted to just suggest that as our policymakers here in the state are doing this work, when we're affecting change like we did with S100 last session, not this last session, but before Keisha's, when we went towards zoning, and as this session increasingly we're moving closer into Act 250, that we're being very mindful of the harm that the pre-existing policy has historically caused as well. So we can also address the repair at the same time that we're doing this work. Because I think it's painful to watch, and it's also irresponsible to do, is when we know that this policy, these zoning policies, and this Act 250 policy has been exclusionary historically and caused a lot of harm, that we disregard that and solely focus on just only making housing available. Let's, as policymakers, please, and those of us who are looking for a better future for all of us, let's focus on the harm that these policies have caused, and also how we can go about, while we are creating better opportunity for housing for all, to how we simultaneously, because we can do more than one thing at the same time, repair the harm. Thanks.
Thank you. And I believe we have a question from our Vermont State Treasurer up here as well.
Thank you.
Close, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Alex, for the question. I just, Michael mentioned that there are a lot of empty homes throughout the country, and I saw an MIT study that talked about 50 million bedrooms every night that go unused, and the proportion for Vermont would be about 100,000 bedrooms that go unused every night. And you think about the number of people who are homeless, or the number of people who are employers that are seeking jobs that no one can fill because they don't have homes. I mean, that could take care of the problem. And we're one of the second oldest states in the country. So I guess my question is really focused on senior housing. I think there's a lot of seniors in Vermont who are sort of overhoused and they don't have anywhere to go. And strategically over the next decade, I think that's going to have to be a focus of ours. How do we build more housing for that population? I wonder if it's something you're confronting in California, or have any advice for us here in Vermont?
Well, I mean, I think the basic economics of the situation is that the average Social Security check is about $1,200, right? Which can't buy you any housing comparable to what they currently have. I think also that, it can be very disruptive to a person's life to move from a place that they've called home for decades, I think that also right now, because of interest rates, but also because of the set tax base that a person has in a house, right? If the house is paid off, they could be paying a very low amount of tax, and so they can't find anything comparable to that. So there have been, like in California, there was a bill passed to allow the tax base from the house to be transferred to another house if you bought down. I mean, I think all of these ideas are important, but I think that, I grew up in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. I was right down from the projects. The projects, when I was growing up, was not a dirty word, okay? And the federal government first didn't maintain or keep places secure, and then they were declared a failure, right? I think if we really want to stay focused on the central issue is that in a country with the wealth that we have to guarantee people a place to live and cover that cost, regardless. Yeah.
Anything? Anything? I would just say
I'll talk to him
is, and I apologize, this is going to unfortunately be our last question. I've got the red light. So I would say some advice about tackling senior housing is really making sure that, of course, we have the finance streams to do that, but also not be prohibitive, right? So a lot of our, at least from the California lens, or maybe you do a little differently in Vermont as well, a lot of our affordable senior housing is really tied to area median income or some sort of income base, right? But for older folks, that could be very different, especially if they had different sources of wealth, and the eligibility can really be messed up. So that's some problems we've had in the past where, you get a source of funding that's based on some sort of criteria or calculation, right? But your senior population you're hoping for, they might be middle class or upper middle class, even older folks, you want to get them to move out of the big house, right? And go to somewhere that is more appropriate and downsized and going to fit their needs. Those eligibility aspects can also be very tricky, right? Because I think you want to serve as broad range of seniors as much as possible, but you don't want to immediately disqualify someone, right? If someone who has pretty good means and they have a house that you'd rather see in a family turnover, they'd say, why go do this and do everything and I'm not even eligible, right? Like a lot of those little friction points that happen in our system, which is why I'm a big advocate for us going to an Asian and European style system where eligibility is just universal basically for everyone for public goods, is one of those really important things. So financing is obviously going to be one of those tough ones. Michael talked about, of course, the reality of social security checks being so little is that then you have to deliver cost competitive products too. And something in California we would try to do is leverage our state and public lands, not forests or beaches, but like other old offices, warehouses that is owned by your state or jurisdiction already, because that way you can either ground lease that for almost $1 to a friendly nonprofit developer, or the government itself can do it. That way you cut out a bunch of land costs, right, which is a huge equation of it, and it's been very successful for us because in California, most of the land is just very, very expensive.
I just want to add one thing too, which is we can do a lot. We talked in the last session about the cost of administration in healthcare. We could do a lot to make it less bureaucratic. I mean, getting a shovel in the ground in Los Angeles, minimum 5 years, okay?
Yes.
When you have these low-income tax credits, that doubles the cost of building a unit, right? So I think we can attack it from that vantage point and bring those costs down and get stuff done far more quickly.
Yeah, and especially as the state treasurer, a lot of the administrative costs is what I call stupid costs, just inefficiencies, because a nonprofit or any entity, I'm sure you know this too, applying for
I'm ready to
grants,
jump in on this one.
right? So you have the ability to unify financing and be like one form, one system,
Yeah.
right, Michael?
18 different sources of funding in the next project that we're going to do groundbreaking on.
Right, and that's
18
time
different
and effort,
sources.
right?
But even getting a building permit
Yeah,
is
a lot of
harrowing.
harrowing. All right, well, on that note, any concluding thoughts, quick concluding thoughts to our discussion today? Let's start with Michael.
Well, I think we've done pretty decently well in terms of a basis for policy in Vermont and also in Burlington. I think there's a ton more work to do. We all know that. There's lots of pieces and parts. I really do believe that it needs not one solution, but about 4 or 5 or 10 solutions. All of them are important. All of them have to be balanced. Resources are the critical piece, though. Can't do anything. We had a lot of money in the last few years. We were able to get some things done. We still need that kind of money for the next 5, 10 years in order to make it work. If Build Back Better was here, man, just rocket ships, frankly, to get things done. So.
The housing crisis is solvable, flat out, period, exclamation point, it's solvable.
Exactly. And I would also say homelessness doesn't have to exist. It's a policy choice. It's a policy choice. And we have all the tools in the toolbox to solve it. And my quick plug, because I know we kind of talked about the supply side aspect of it, is that yes, there are people that will, and corporations that are going to profit off of the scarcity right now, and it's that vicious cycle. But if we look to one of my favorite examples, Red Vienna in Austria, is that they embrace all the solutions together. Because the fact of the matter is, you can't prey on scarcity if there's no scarcity. And the reason that they have ranked 2 years in a row the most livable city in the world in Vienna is because they have a robust public sector development sector. So as a consumer, you say, I can go to a publicly developed flat, a flat that I will have unlimited term in, that is very affordable, has all the great amenities, or I go to the private market, which is much shorter contract, much more expensive, and so that actually has kept the price relatively down compared to other European big cities. And you know, the market itself is susceptible to its own forces. If there is competition, even from the public sector, which our European friends know very well, and I'm always thankful Senator Sanders is introducing me to Scandinavian politics and how they do things, is that if you have a government that plays in competition and forces the market to respond to that, they also have to respond, right? Right now what we have is a market that's unchecked. They have no competition, and so they charge the highest rank. So anyways, thank you so much to the Sanders Institute for having us, and hope to learn more at home.
No. Hi, everybody. Could people please take their seats? I know we all want to talk about everything, but we're going to start. Could people please take their seats? So the next panel will be talking about specifically fighting for the working class. I think we have Sarah Nelson, who's the president of the Association of Flight Attendants. We have Les Leopold, who's an author and the executive director of the Labor Institute. And Saru Jayaraman, who's president of One Fair Wage. We will be starting with Saru. Come on up. The whole panel can come up. Yeah, okay.
Hello, hi. How is everybody doing this afternoon? Good. My name is Saru Jayaraman. I am both a professor at UC Berkeley and I also lead a national organization representing the 13 million restaurant and service workers across the country, fighting to raise wages and end sub-minimum wages across the country for the 52 million Americans who earn less than $15 an hour. I've been doing this for 22 years, since 9/11. We started this work right after 9/11 when there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Windows on the World, and the union that was inside that restaurant, which was HERE before it merged with Unite, asked me, I was a young organizer at the time, to start a relief center for the workers who had lost their jobs and the families of the victims. And what started as a relief center post 9/11 grew into a national organization called ROC, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, organizing restaurant workers all over the country. And everywhere we went all over the country, we would ask workers in this industry, what are your top needs and concerns? And everywhere we went, from California to deep south, to the Midwest, to the Northeast, they would say, it's my wages, it's my wages, it's my wages. And when we asked why, or we looked at why, it makes sense. The restaurant industry has been the absolute largest private sector employer in the United States for decades. It's 13 million workers. That's nearly 1 in 10 American workers. 1 in 2 Americans has worked in the industry at some point in their lifetime. How many people here ever worked in a restaurant? Look around the room. 1 in 2 Americans has worked in the industry at some point in their lifetime. It is the largest private sector employer of women. It is the largest private sector of young people. It is the largest private sector employer of immigrants, of formerly incarcerated individuals, of people of color, pretty much everybody. But it is the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States of America, and it has been for generations due to a very ugly racial and political history. Prior to emancipation, waiters in the US, here in New England, and where there were restaurants in the 1850s, were white men, and they got only wages, no tips. Tipping was actually pretty reviled. Tipping had originated in feudal Europe as something that aristocrats gave to serfs and vassals, but always on top of a wage, never instead of a wage. In fact, if you remember a man named Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America and he wrote about how great is American democracy, he said one of the hallmarks of American democracy is they don't tip. They're a democracy. But something changed. In 1853, those white male waiters went on a coordinated strike, which is pretty incredible for a time when there was no phones or social media. They went on a coordinated strike in multiple cities and decided that they want higher wages. And the restaurant industry immediately started looking for cheaper labor. And first they found it in white women, but after emancipation, they hit upon what they felt was a jackpot. There were 2 sectors of hospitality that were asked to work for nothing. One was a very famous industry called the Pullman Train Company. Prior to the planes you're going to hear about from Sarah, this was the way white people traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast and back. Headquartered in Chicago, they hired 10,000 black men, named them all George as a way to dehumanize them, and said, you're not going to earn a wage, you're going to get the lovely thing called a tip from white people carrying whose luggage you carry. Those workers, if you remember, organized the first black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and won the right to one fair wage in 1937, a full minimum wage with tips on top. But there was another industry doing exactly the same thing. It was the restaurant industry. They were hiring black women. Pullman trains hiring black men, restaurants hiring black women, telling those women the same thing. You're not going to get a wage. You're going to rely on the tips from customers who serve you. And that was the way it was. When the Pullman car porters organized first in 1919 to form their union in 1937, when they won one fair wage, the Restaurant Association was formed. The National Restaurant Association, we call it the other NRA, was formed in 1919 with the express mission, intent, and purpose of ensuring that the black women in the restaurant industry never got what the Pullman car porters got in the trains. And in 1938, they succeeded when everybody else got the right to a federal minimum wage, except for tipped workers, who were told, you don't get a wage, you rely on this thing called tips. And we went from $0 in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for the largest employer of women, people of color, youth, immigrants in the United States of America in 2024. It's not some niche group. It's where all of us worked, our kids work. It's the largest employer in America, and it gets to pay $2 an hour because we've let it. And today, this workforce is still overwhelmingly women, over 2/3 women, disproportionately women of color, struggling with the highest rates of both poverty and sexual harassment of any industry because they have to put up with so much from customers to get their income in tips. There are 7 states that got rid of this: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska. But Vermont is one of 43 states that persists with this legacy of slavery, with a shameful wage here, I'm sorry to tell you, of just over $6 an hour here in the great state of Vermont. And in these 43 states, you have a population that is overwhelmingly women, young women, tolerating such high levels of sexual harassment that it ends up impacting their entire lives. One of Senator Sanders' colleagues, Senator Klobuchar, has told me, you know, I've endured sexual harassment even as a legislator, but I did nothing about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants. And I cannot tell you the number of millions of women I have heard that same story from, because our industry sets the standard for what is normal, legal, ethical, acceptable for young women for their entire lives, because it is so bad in the restaurant industry. And with the pandemic, it got so much worse. With the pandemic, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. We started a relief fund, unexpectedly raised $24 million. It all went out the door to 300,000 workers who came to us for relief. And of those 300,000 workers, 2/3 told us they couldn't even get unemployment insurance because in states like Vermont, they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. And then they went back to work, and 12,000 workers died. No, 12,000 workers were murdered because they were forced to go back to work before it was safe into an industry that the CDC named as the most dangerous place for adults to be during the pandemic, more dangerous than hospitals, more deaths than hospitals, because they were not paid enough. They died because they were poor. For those that survived, 60% told us that tips went way down, and the women, more than half of women told us harassment went way up. They said, I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much I want to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much I want to tip. And on and on and on. So much so that when they were asked to enforce the same COVID protocols on the same people, the customers from whom they had to get tips to survive, they were done. And they started leaving the industry en masse. Now, in the midst of all of that, in 2021, I want to thank Senator Sanders for being the sponsor of the Raise the Wage Act, for fighting for tipped workers, for giving some of this speech I'm telling you right now on the Senate floor. Thank you, Senator Sanders, because in 2021, the House passed the Raise the Wage Act. We couldn't get it through the Senate, but it was the first time since emancipation that either House of Congress voted to end this legacy of slavery. It was a huge victory. We didn't get it through the Senate, but it marked a change for us because two things. One, we realized that we are never going, because the National Restaurant Association has been such a block, not just for tipped workers, but as Senator Sanders can tell you, for all workers. They are the reason why the minimum wage hasn't gone up since 2009. It's the other NRA. Our industry plays an outsized role in determining wages in this country across the board, not just in the restaurant industry. They are the major opposition in every state, including Vermont. They are the major opposition at the federal level. And there can be no change at the federal level until we defeat the other NRA. And we are on our way. I'm here to give you very good news. There is a moment of worker power that's not, it is, yes, incredible unionization efforts and something even more diffuse and huge that you haven't heard about because it hasn't been reported on, which is that with the pandemic, when we didn't get the Raise the Wage Act, 1.2 million workers walked off the job. 1.2 million restaurant workers said, enough is enough, take your job and shove it. You always told me that the worst that could happen is that I'd lose my job. I lost my job and I'm standing. Or you always said to me if I didn't like it, I could leave, so I left. 1.2 million workers left. We surveyed, as I said, 300,000. 90% said the only thing that would make me come back is a livable wage with tips on top. And then they won it. So here's the thing. There were some negative consequences to the fact that all those workers left. And the industry faced the most acute staffing crisis in history. One, the National Restaurant Association spearheaded bills in 22 states to weaken child labor laws so that in Wisconsin, 13-year-olds can serve alcohol in bars. That did pass through one of the houses of the Wisconsin legislature. Another negative thing, which all of you have experienced, as there were staffing crises across multiple sectors, mostly women-led sectors, the restaurant industry became a beacon, an example for many other industries who didn't want to raise workers' wages in response to worker shortages, and so they started introducing tipping everywhere, in the airport, in the retail environments, in the kiosks. Suddenly you saw tipping everywhere. Why? Because other sectors saw this beautiful boondoggle that the restaurant industry has had for 150 years and said if they get to replace wages with tips, we want to do it too. And so as long as we allow the other NRA to continue with what they're doing, every sector is going to want to have tipping. Every sector is going to want to have a $2 wage. Who wouldn't? If the largest sector gets to do it, why can't every other sector? But here's the thing. When workers walked off the job en masse, and I want to ask you, and I have had some labor people who say, use this word, other labor people say don't, so forgive me if I offend anybody, but when 1.2 million workers walked off the job, many of them in collective walkouts, demand more, and then win it in the marketplace, wouldn't you call that a strike in any other sector, in any other example? And if it's a strike, then it's the largest strike in US history, 1.2 million workers. We tracked thousands of restaurants all over the country that were forced to raise wages to recruit and retain staff. In some cases, we saw 1,000% wage increases. In Dallas, Texas, restaurants paying $2, now forced to pay $25. In Cape Cod, in Massachusetts, they were allowed to pay $5, they were paying $50, because who the hell can live and work in Cape Cod for $5 an hour? So huge wage increases, and we realized in 2022, we are on the cusp of an incredibly historic moment, and we decided it was time to go huge. We launched something called 25 by 250, where we're moving bills and ballot measures in 25 states, half the country, to beat the NRA, raise the overall wage closer to the cost of living, and end all sub-minimum wages, not just for tipped workers, but workers with disabilities and youth, and incarcerated workers, another legacy of slavery, and gig workers, and everybody, and that is what we are fighting for now. We have bills and ballot measures moving this year in 12 states, and we are on the ballot with huge overall wage increases in Michigan, on the ballot this November, Ohio, on the ballot this November, Arizona, on the ballot this November, Massachusetts, on the ballot this November. We have a big piece of legislation moving in Illinois. This year alone, with 5 states, we are going to raise 3.5 million workers' wages, because guess what? When minimum wage is on the ballot, it never, ever fails. Ever, because I know there were so many panels today that said, this is the most important issue, this is the most important issue, this is the most important issue. We don't have to compete. We don't have to compete. But I will tell you, for communities of color that I represent, and for young workers that I represent, there is no competition. The economy, cost of living, and jobs with living wages, by far, every poll of young people, every poll of people of color, right now there's an affordability crisis. It's two sides of the same coin. We don't have to compete. The cost of housing is one side, and the ability to pay for it and everything else is the other side. And if we do not raise people's wages closer to where they can afford to live, we are going to see increasing numbers of what I'm experiencing in the restaurant industry, which is I am seeing literally an 1,000% increase in restaurant workers living in their car. I live in San Francisco. I cannot tell you the number of workers I know who live in their car during the week in San Francisco and live in Tracy and Stockton, an hour and a half away, to commute. They live during the week in the city and on weekends outside of the city. It is insane. The crisis is insane. And poll after poll, this is Latino voters, Ohio. I mean, it's not even a competition. It's not even close. This is what people are saying is their top issue this year. The only thing, again, that would determine how they're going to vote and who they're going to vote for. Not even a competition. And so what we are doing is putting the issue on the ballot in a way that will mobilize 3.5 million people who can go vote themselves a raise in battleground states. And also, our polling is showing a bare minimum of 350,000 people have said that they will vote for people who support their raise while they're at the ballot in these battleground states. So as long as people actually talk about it and run on it, it will help. Because here's the bottom line, and I will stop. So about a month and a half ago, Jim Comer, the Republican head of the Oversight Committee, sent a letter to the IRS asking that both One Fair Wage and Black Voters Matter be investigated. We were the first two in a long list of groups that they've been after. Following that investigation, a far-right Christian conservative radio show in Michigan doxed me. They sent lots of people to my house, pounding on my kids' windows in the middle of the night. We had to move the family out of the home. We had to get armed security. Most places I travel with a bodyguard. I have a stalker now who has sent like a very long string of horrific, violent death threats. And I have to ask you, do I look that threatening? I'm 5'2" and a half. I'm not that threatening as a person. But clearly there's something incredibly threatening about what we're doing if they have to scare us and my family and our organization in this way. And I'll tell you what it is. On the one hand, it is that we are about to win historic wage increases for millions of people this year and end a legacy of slavery that is the raison d'etre for one of the largest trade corporate lobbies in the country, the National Restaurant Association, that is going to lead to Senator Sanders being able to pass, finally, a living wage for all in Congress. And the other thing that's incredibly threatening is that we are actually going to change democracy. I know I am biased, but I'm representing 52 million Americans who work 2 and 3 jobs, and this is why it's not a competition with all of our issues, because if these folks can work 1 job instead of 2 or 3, they would have the time and capacity to work on healthcare and climate change and everything else everybody in this room cares deeply about. I have a population that is ready to work on those things, but doesn't have the capacity to do it. I've asked them, what would you work on if you could only work 1 job? They've said climate change. They've said public education. They've said, I would do so much, but I barely have time to survive right now. I just have to get from job to job. I never see my children. If I have children, more and more young minimum wage workers are deciding not to have kids. It is a tragic situation, and there's both a threat, but when somebody is so threatened by you, when the opposition is so threatened by you, you have to ask, what is the opportunity? The opportunity is this November to have 3.5 million workers get a raise and then turn around and work on all of the issues everybody else cares about in the room. Thank you.
Now I know how a band feels when the warm-up act was the Beatles. Wow, fantastic.
You want to take that? Thank you.
My name's Les Leopold. I'm the director of the Labor Institute. I've got a new book out called Wall Street's War on Workers. And I'm already being pulled off the stage. We've heard a lot of stuff in the last 24 hours. I've heard how the public used to be 70+% environmentalists, and now it's down to 38%. I've heard Senator Sanders say how workers' wages are like $50 below in buying power than it was in the 1970s. I've heard how the oil industry is ripping us off and has been for years and years. We've heard how child labor law bills are trying to be passed right now. We've heard incredible stories about health care. We don't have a single payer, and we don't have affordable housing. Why? Well, answer number one, of course, is Bernie Sanders is not president. That's the first thing. But I want to bring some perspective to the why question. And I think part of the answer is that we are losing the working class, not necessarily the ones that you're representing, but overall, especially white working people. Let me give you an example. Mingo County, West Virginia, 95% white. It's the home of the first big organizing drives of the United Mine Workers. The coal wars took place in Mingo County. It's only 25,000 people. It became an occupied zone where state and federal troops came in to stop the bloodshed and sided, of course, with the employers. President Roosevelt lifted the siege, and Mingo County started to flourish as a mine workers area, and they rewarded the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton in 1996 got 69.7% of the vote. What did Joe Biden get? 13.9%. So what's so special about Mingo County? That little county lost the most coal jobs of any county in the country. It went from 3,300 jobs to 300 jobs, coal jobs, in a population of 25,000. Okay, so what happened? What did we do? I won't blame one particular party, but what was done? Where were the programs to help these workers who would sacrifice life and limb to build this country? Well, we left it to free enterprise. And here's what free enterprise did. 2 small drugstores started to compete with each other to put out opioid prescriptions. They found doctors that would, about an hour and away, that would sign them. They were putting out 1 opioid prescription per minute. Cars were lined up in a 5-state area to come in there. That's what they did. It might have created 5 or 6 jobs, but the public approach had been abandoned. The era of big government is over. It could have been done so easily, going from town to town and say, what do you need? We need our schools rebuilt. We need our roads rebuilt. We need these mountains that have been ripped apart, reclamated. We need the streams cleaned up. Thousands of people could have been put to work. Instead, they were giving out opioid prescriptions. After studying this, we looked at, well, is there some sort of relationship between mass layoffs and the vote for the Democratic Party? Is this what's kind of boiling underneath the politics today? Well, kind of an interesting thing happened. Well, first of all, a mass layoff is 50 or more people laid off at the same time. How many people here have gone through a mass layoff? Yeah. When I ask a room full of steelworkers, I'm a member of the steelworkers, we do a lot of training with the steelworkers, 80% of the room raises their hands. When I ask how many people went through 2, it's about 20%. There have been 30 million mass layoffs since 1996. There's a database that runs from 1996 to 2012, and then the Obama administration shut it down during their austerity drive, that collects information by county of mass layoffs. So we investigated the blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. We looked at the counties, and we found that the counties that were whiter, poorer, and had less education had the highest mass layoff rates. We found 112 of those counties. They averaged 33% mass layoff rate during that period. A third of the people went through a mass layoff. Their Democratic vote went down. The counties that had fewer mass layoffs, the Democratic vote went up. All right, so I was making the claim in this book that mass layoffs are a key to politics. Doing something about it is a key to politics. But the pushback is, whoa, wait a second. What about those people being deplorables? There's a whole cottage industry about writing about how racist, sexist, xenophobic these people are, right? There's a new book called White Rural Rage. Don't read it, it's terrible. It's my competition, but it really is terrible. I was forced to investigate that. We found 23 questions in these long-term voter survey polls. Where hundreds of thousands of people answered these questions. 23 of them on hot-button social issues. And you know what we found? Also, we then cut the pie down so it was white working-class people, the villains. They said they were white, they're in the bottom two-thirds of the income distribution, and they don't have a four-year college degree. That's our definition. We found in no case have they become more illiberal. We found in half of the questions they became much more liberal. Let me give you an example. About 20 years ago, they asked the same question. Should gay couples be able to adopt children? It went from, magic, 38% 20 years ago. Today, 76%. We asked, or they asked, should illegal aliens, that was the question, be able to become citizens if they've been here 3 years, paid taxes, and had no felonies? That went from 32% to 62%. We found there are, and Senator Sanders knows this, we found there are from 15 to 25 million non-Democrats who are socially liberal. Some of them, many of them, millions of them are very liberal socially. But they are furious about job instability. Now think about it for a second. This is the United States of America. Where are you without a job? You're nowhere. You can't support your family. When you get thrown out of a job with 500 other people and you're racing around competing to find the last job at the dollar store, the last job in the restaurant, the last job at Walmart, you feel awful. Your sense of well-being has been destroyed. We now have health data that shows that being laid off from your job is the 7th most severe event in your life, the equivalent of losing your eyesight or having impaired hearing, more traumatic than a divorce or a death of a close friend. The impact on health is dramatic. Now, I got pushed into this investigation because I'm a graduate of Oberlin College. And in the middle of the pandemic, they laid off 114 UAW members who were in food service and janitorial services. They didn't lay them off. They, of course, got rid of them and replaced them with subcontractors, non-union. So we fought the fight as alumni. We lost. We raised some money for people. But we also did interviews with them. We had a whole project of students that went around and interviewed them. And the results were just unbelievable. They were heartbroken. They were crestfallen. They were crying. They could not go to town anymore. They wouldn't drive anywhere near the college. They felt their lives had been ruined. And in this book, I dedicate it to them, and each chapter begins with one of their quotes. And we sent copies to all those who wanted them, just to say, look, you opened my eyes. I mean, I had gotten used to mass layoffs. I hate to say this, but most of us have gotten used to mass layoffs. They're inevitable, right? It's just the way capitalism operates. It's technology. It's, it's AI. It's not that. What it is, as Senator Sanders again knows, it's the combination of anti-worker trade deals, stock buybacks, leverage buyouts. Give you an example, most recently, Elon Musk buys Twitter. He borrows a huge amount of money to do it. He's not paying back the debt. The debt is placed on Twitter. The debt service went from $50 million a year to $1 billion. What's the first thing he does? He lays off 5,000 workers. This happens again and again and again. Every single day, there is a mass layoff. Okay, that's the depressing part. And the worst part, though, is this goes again back to what Senator Sanders says. It's souring people on democracy. What good is a democracy if I can't hold on to my job? You guys are corrupt. You're dominated by corporations. They're walking all over us. Do something. Well, you remember President Trump and Carrier air conditioning? That was an eye-opener. He didn't save all the jobs he said he was going to save. It was a USW facility, steelworker facility. About 800 of the 1,100 workers kept their job, and they were very happy about it. The polling afterwards shows that was wildly popular with the American public. Both Democrats and Republicans thought that was a great thing to do. They interviewed the president of United Technology, which owns Carrier, and they asked him, why did you go along with this? And he said, I was born at night, but not last night. We get 10% of our revenue from the federal government, and we know defense spending is going to go up. So they knew if you're going to play ball with the federal government, don't lay off these workers. At least don't do it in a compulsory way. Maybe you can do it in a non-compulsory way. Let me go to one more. It's a big day for you, Senator Sanders. Let me go to another one. Senator Sanders gave a beautiful speech about a Siemens plant that was going to go under in Iowa, I believe it was. And Siemens was getting $750 million from the federal government, and they're going to lay off workers there. Well, they were going to lay off 1,700 workers in the United States and 3,000 in Germany. Here's what happened. All 1,700 in the United States got laid off because Sanders wasn't elected president, couldn't stop it. In Germany, they have co-determination. Half the seats on the board are workers. And the union, and we got a chance to interview one of the leaders of that union. What they did was they kept negotiating, researching, negotiating. And Siemens, a global corporation that has to deal with prices on the world market, agreed to, catch this, no compulsory layoffs. They would do buyout packages, and it was voluntary whether someone accepted it. On top of that, there were 6 plants that were going to go down in small towns. All of them stayed open. They put a different product in those plants. If that happened in the United States, people would think they died and went to heaven. Both the people in the town. Instead, the plant's gone. All those, there was like, 8, 10 plants in the United States, they're all gone. So what do we do about this? We have to do, so my book had like these 2 revelations, one about mass layoffs, one about deplorables. The third thing that's been going on is I've been having a conversation in my head with Sarah Nelson and Senator Sanders. And lo and behold, I get invited to this thing, and I can actually have it out loud with both of them. So needless to say, I haven't slept in 3 nights trying to figure out just how to say this. Well, Senator Sanders, Jane told me this. Back in 1996, he had a no payoff for layoffs bill that went, at that point, catch this, the Defense Department was going to give money to corporations to help them do mergers, which of course were going to lay off thousands of people. Senator Sanders joined with a conservative congressman, and they put forth a bill to stop it. And I don't know for sure whether it was actually stopped or not. I couldn't find that article, but it was a great idea. So I've stolen his idea, updated it, and how about this? And this room could actually make this happen. How about we put into the Democratic Party platform, both parties, of course. I don't want to get you in trouble, Jay. Into the party platform, A simple sentence. For every federal contract over a certain amount, $500,000, there will be no forced layoffs and no stock buybacks. You can't use taxpayer money to lay off taxpayers. How much money are we talking about? I believe it's about $700 billion a year in federal contracts. Now, a corporation would be totally free to reject this, totally free. They can, if they want to do layoffs, don't take the federal money. Well, they were born at night, but not last night. They're going to take the federal money, and they're going to agree to it. So if we want to wake up the white working class again, and it's not just the white anymore, we're starting to see black and brown workers turning from the Democratic Party, why not put that in the platform? I'm on my hands and knees, Senator Sanders. Try to get it into the Democratic Party platform. This room has enough community people in it, organizations, that you could make this happen. That's part one. That's my wish for Senator Sanders and for this room. The second one is for Sarah Nelson and her good friend, Shawn Fain, who is the president of the UAW. 94% of the private sector is unorganized. We are never going to, I've been in the labor movement now for 45 years, we're never going to organize them in sufficient numbers, plant by plant by plant. The labor law is stacked against us. We need a movement. And I think we could build a movement around a simple issue. Call the organization, just for the heck of it, Workers United Against Mass Layoffs. If it's headed by Sarah and Shawn, people are going to come running. Have the dues $1 a month, cheap. And what will it do? It will fight for the legislation that is going to be in the Democratic Party platform. For sure, by August, I know we're going to make that happen. And it's going to intervene as best it can when people are facing a mass layoff. It'll try to embarrass the corporation. You're getting all this money from the federal government. You're getting all this money from the state. It would do litigation. It wouldn't need a huge staff. And I know foundations, for example, that would throw money at this to help us reach the unorganized workers. And you know, of course, that would create thousands of leads that would lead to new plants. People need an organization to join, especially the unorganized workers. And we need to do something about mass layoffs. If we don't, the alienation of working people, especially white working people, their drift away from progressives is going to grow and grow and grow. We have to do something about it. And thank you for hopefully trying. I really appreciate it.
Okay, my name is Sarah Nelson. I'm the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, and I'm standing between you and ice cream. That's not a good place to be. It is an incredible honor to be here. It's an incredible honor to be on the stage with both of you. Saru, I think that in addition to the fact that you're planning to take all of this money from the Restaurant Association and threaten them in that way, they are also terrified that every single person in this room will run through a wall after that speech. So, my pronouns are she, her. I loved getting the call from Jane. She said, would you come? I said, I have a whole bunch of conflicts, but yes. She said, then would you be on a panel? I said, of course. She said, I haven't even told you what it is yet. I said, it doesn't matter. You're asking. I'll be there. That is true because Bernie and Jane have, I think, in my view, given more to this country than any other couple here. And so we have our organizer-in-chief. And in 2015, I was, well, let me just start here, first of all. We're talking, this panel is about fighting for the working class. And a lot of times people get a little screwed up about what that means. Who's fighting for the working class? Is it unions? Is it politicians? Is it the workers themselves? Let's be really clear. Let's not divide ourselves further from a corporate class who has been trying to divide us since the beginning of time to extract all of our money and all of our time, and be very clear that the labor movement is the entire working class. It is not just people who currently have a union card.
That's right. Thank you.
you. So my union is a union that was built by women in 1945. It is still run by women. I think it's the only union in the country where that is true. And it was really important to us to have our craft union because it was about fighting sexism. It was about getting our issues to the table and having self-determination about what was important to us at the table. We had to fight through incredible discrimination in order to turn the job into a career. But I also know, as today is 20 years since my dad passed in the middle of the United Airlines bankruptcy, and 10 years since I became president of our union. Being here in Burlington, Vermont with all of you and at the invitation of Jane feels like an incredible hug from the universe on this day. But I think about what was happening during that time and what my education was about capitalism unchecked. And it's interesting that it intersects with Saru's history as well. Because on September 11th, 2001, I had been a 5-year flight attendant who had started this job without any understanding of what being a union member meant, without any understanding of how our economy really worked, other than the fact that when I got there, I had the rest of my flying partners tell me that we had been on strike 11 years earlier. As far as they were concerned, it had been the day before. They were still carrying scab lists, making it very clear who was on which side and what kind of decisions people had made and what the consequences were for making those decisions. And I got a real education in how to take care of each other and what to expect from each other. But also my first day on the job, a flight attendant of 35 years. This is in 1996, so she's been flying for 35 years. Her voice was raspy because we'd only just beat big tobacco and gotten smoking out of our workplace. And so she had served all those years with secondhand smoke, but she said, listen, management thinks of us as their wives or their mistresses, and in either case, they hold us in contempt. Woo, that was a lot at 23, fresh out of company training. But then she said, your only place of worth is with your fellow flying partners. And if we stick together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. And that idea of solidarity was really exciting to me. And I got involved in our union, and I actually was a very dissident voice in the union because I didn't think we were doing enough to push harder on the company and get what we deserved. But then 5 years later comes September 11th. And Flight 175, and it's the flight you can picture flying into the South Tower of the World Trade Center because all the cameras were trained on that site because American Flight 11 had flown in 17 minutes earlier. And so I know the exact moment that my friends, Amy, Michael, and another Amy, Catherine, Robert, Alicia, Al, Marianne, and Jesus died. And I know what it was like to go to that crisis room at Logan Airport and see their pictures and try to figure out how we were going to do without them, but also how we were going to face together what was coming at us. Practically overnight, mass layoffs, 100,000 people laid off, essentially overnight in the airline industry. And what we didn't know, and when we were pulling together and people were talking about patriotism in this country as pulling together and being anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, that what we didn't know was that crisis capitalists started planning in that very moment while we were grieving how to change the market value of a flight attendant, of a pilot, of a mechanic, of a gate agent, of any ground service handler, of how to contract out work, of how to define work differently because it has a different business model, because there's a different employer making the decision. They were planning that just like they had planned it in every other industry, where we used to have a huge hub in Pittsburgh, but after the steel factories left, 4,000 flight attendants lost their jobs in Pittsburgh and had to go somewhere else. That had already happened, but they had planned on now tackling those union contracts in aviation that had kept up a certain standard for the world. And they did. Through those bankruptcies, they took pay, they took our pensions, they took our time. People agreed to give more time on the job because they couldn't pay their bills, because they were no longer making enough money. So they said, of course we'll work more. And so they took away the work rules that we had bargained. In 1945, when we organized and we put our demands on the table as flight attendants for the first time, stewardesses, we got 4 things of consequence in that contract. We got a double-digit raise. We got a cap on the number of hours that we could work. We got a seniority list so that schedulers could no longer try to ask us for sexual favors in return for our schedules, and the basis to fight every other discrimination issue on the job. And we got an 8-hour day. In the airline industry, we got an 8-hour day in that 1946 contract. That was because workers had been fighting for 80 years and dying for that 8-hour day. And the next year, Taft-Hartley was passed after we were trying to define, and FDR had defined in 1944, the Economic Bill of Rights for this country that we have not been willing to talk about until Bernie Sanders stood at the podium and said he was running for president. That we should expect a job, that we should expect an adequate wage and a decent living, that we should expect a decent home, medical care, sickness, accident, old age and unemployment protection from those things that we may face in life, a good education. We were talking about a 32-hour work week in 1944, and we haven't talked about it again until this year with Bernie Sanders and Sean Fain. So we have a lot of work to do, but we have work to do to take on capitalism, because we have to be very clear that capitalism is never, ever going to be for any of these things. There is no competitive world in which they want to fight to make sure that a company is providing the best jobs, that a company is providing the best health care, that a company is providing the best job security. Only because of the issues that have been put forward since, and I think about this moment in 2015 when Bernie gathered the unions together and made the pitch for running for president. And I remember being in the room, and he concluded his whole presentation with, "And if all of you come with me, we can do this." And I remember in 2015, I was a little more naive. And I was there in the front of the room, and I was ready to run through a wall then. And I leaped up and I said, "Yes! So are we doing this?" And I turned around and there was silence. Then they endorsed Hillary a few weeks later. But what Bernie Sanders knew was that it wasn't the heads of unions that he was speaking to. It was the working class that he was speaking to. And so one of the reasons that unions are one of the most popular ideas in this country is because Bernie Sanders went around this country telling people that the trade union movement is the only way for us to lift up the standards for the working class. It is the only way to get back to the issues that we were talking about 100 years ago and pushing forward on them. It is the only way to build the power that we need to change our politics. It is the only way to give working people agency to feel that democracy is something that they own, not that the capital class does. Mm-hmm. And so we have seen the incredible benefit of Bernie Sanders' attempt to run for president, and he is our organizer-in-chief. And just recently, Breeze Airways flight attendants, a startup airline by David Neeleman, who also started JetBlue and many other airlines. It's going to continue to grow, and it's giving service to communities actually that have not been served, and mostly in the South. These are flight attendants who are based there. We just won this election by 76%, and one of the flight attendant organizers said, I was actually at the rally where the bird landed on the podium in Portland, Oregon. And I didn't know anything about unions. But Bernie Sanders talked about unions, and that stayed with me until I got this job and I had this opportunity to fight for a union for myself. There are so many working people out there who today are building the labor movement from the ground up because these ideas were given to people. Mother Jones said over 100 years ago, she said, the capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, except the fact that they themselves are continually organizing shows us their real beliefs. The capitalists want the most amount of labor for the least amount of money, including slavery. Labor wants the most amount of money for the least amount of labor. We have to be proud of that, by the way. Innovation and productivity and advancements in technology should be put in the workers' pockets as much as the corporate elite. If you would only understand that you hold the solution to the whole problem in your hand. If, for example, every worker were to simply hold up and stop working, the capitalists would yield to any and all demands because the world could simply not go on. Now, Mother Jones was talking about a general strike. She was talking about the idea that Shawn Fain has put forward, where workers will line up their contracts for May 1st, 2028. And I want to be really clear that we need to plan for that general strike. We need to plan for that uprising. But the importance of this is helping people understand that working people have the power. They have all of the power in the world. They actually have all of the creativity and ingenuity and all of the ability to create the changes that we need. We talked about getting a vaccine in a very short time earlier. We tried to get that vaccine formula available to everyone around the world so that we could end that pandemic. And the for-profit prescription drug companies fought us like hell because they want to retain control, and they don't care if people die. They don't care if people suffer. We are the ones who care. So the working class has to have the ability to have power, and that is only through our unions. The labor movement is for all working people, but if we don't build our institutions, lasting institutions where we can exercise that power, we're going to miss this moment. We're going to miss the opportunity to get all of the things in that economic Bill of Rights that were listed, including addressing the existential crisis of climate change in a way that builds up a new economy that is for all of us. We have these opportunities right now, but it requires making sure that working people lock in that power by organizing their unions. And one of the biggest things that we could do right now is not only support the strikes that are going on and the organizing that's going on, and I want to be very clear, Starbucks baristas did us a huge favor by organizing, and many people would have said that that was not strategic, that wasn't manufacturing jobs, that wasn't in tech, that wasn't these areas where it would be strategic to try to tackle our economy. No, you know what it was? It was people saying that we're going to organize even though people should say that this is a throwaway job, that this is a college job, that this is a job for immigrants and women, and so it doesn't have as much value. They said, no, no, no. Economic rights are directly tied to social rights, and this job matters too. And the corporate elite have been trying to tell us for the last 50 years that you should feel lucky to have a job. We're going to make sure they know they should feel lucky to have our work. And so these Starbucks baristas, who you would think have the least amount of power and the least amount of ability to get people's attention, took the nation by storm and took Bernie's ideas and actioned them and told other working people how they could do it. There are not enough unions to take on the organizing drives that need to happen. And so what we need to do is we need to invest in an organization that can pick up the call of any worker who wants to organize their workplace, that can help connect them either to a union drive or can stick with them, have them affiliate with the organization, give them the administrative backing with the forms that they need to file, give them an organizer to talk to, give them the backing of comms people and attorneys, and help them all the way through those first contracts. And if we don't invest hundreds of millions of dollars in this right now, shame on us, because we have to put the power in the hands of working people. And we have to get them their unions. Because in our unions, this is the last non-self-selecting place in this country. This is the place where we can hear from each other. This is the place where to go on strike, you have to have at least 90% of the workplace with you. Where in politics can anybody say that I'm going to get something done with 90% support, other than for wars? Okay? But you have to do that. And when people do that, we define the problem. So many people have done such a good job of defining the problem here today. We set the demands by asking people, and walk into any union hall or any workplace, and people can tell you exactly what they want. And it's the same for everyone. I want a living wage to be able to take care of my family. I want to be able to afford a house that's near where I work so I don't have to spend all my time commuting. I want to be able to further my education or provide that opportunity for my children. And I want to be able to contribute to this world in a meaningful way. Those scientists who created that vaccine, one of the biggest arguments that the prescription drug companies made was that if we give this away, we are going to be devaluing that ingenuity, that creativity, and no one will ever create anything again. That's complete and total BS, and we all know it. We're going to hear from Stephanie Kelton later today about finding the money to do the policy initiatives that we need to do. And the money is there. It's simply a policy decision. But we can only do this if we understand that we're going to put the power in the hands of working people. We're going to attack capital where it is. The only person that Elon Musk has to listen to is a group of workers who organize in his shops. And even on that rocket that he built to go into outer space and leave the rest of us on a burning Earth, there were flight attendants who were contacting us to get organized. So that's what we're going to do. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. Talk about call to organize. We have ice cream out on the terrace, and we are going to come back. Oh no, out on the terrace that way. Okay, and then we are going to come back and start promptly at 3:30. Okay, so you can bring your ice cream inside and sit down and enjoy. Thank you very much.
Hospitals and insurers are robbing all of us.
100 million Americans drowning in medical debt.
When hospitals and insurers don't show us their prices, they charge us whatever they want.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun.
American citizens in need of care, afraid to enter a hospital.
I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home.
We look to our elected officials in Congress to put a stop to the overcharging.
Empower us with real prices and hold hospitals and insurance companies accountable.
We demand actual prices and true transparency in healthcare.
No woman, no cry.
For far too long, hospitals across this nation have profited from concealing their prices from patients.
No woman, no cry.
Not doctors and nurses, but big business, getting rich on hiding the truth from the sick.
Little darling, don't shed no tear. No woman, no cry.
Our healthcare system is crushing the American dream
Good friends we have, and good friends we
by robbing workers, employers, unions, and families.
along the way.
I remember opening up that first bill. It was just complete shock, and I was so hurt.
In this great future, you can't forget your past.
You choose what bills to pay, paying rent or paying the hospital.
So dry your tears.
You're focusing on, oh my God, how am I gonna eat? I'm gonna do anything.
There are laws on the books that mean prices are now a patient's right. But providers continued with a lack of transparency. We have the right to know healthcare costs up front.
When we can't see or compare prices, hospitals charge us whatever they want. They robbing us.
You're just going to do whatever they say just because it'll hopefully get you one step closer. So you get this bill that's insane.
For far too long, hospitals across this nation have profited from concealing prices from patients.
So we call on all our politicians, City Hall to Congress, and all the way up to President Biden, to enforce the existing rules for price transparency.
We need transparency in healthcare, and we demand it.
It's our health. It's our money.
Power to the patients.
Power to the patients.
Power to the patients.
Okay, we at the Sanders Institute believe that a vital democracy requires an informed electorate. And there are 3 people that we're going to be hearing from tonight that have spent their lives doing this and doing it incredibly well. They're exceptional writers, they're exceptional researchers, and they're wonderful people as well. So let me introduce John Nichols from The Nation, John Quealy from Common Dreams, and David Sirota from The Lever. Lever? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jane. Sirota is going to make a dramatic appearance here. People have been, this is how he does it. In fact, he knows how to be a media star because everybody's like, where is David Sirota? He didn't just walk up with everybody else, but here he is running into the room, taking the stage, having recently recovered from COVID. David Sirota. All right. as Jane said, I'm John Nichols. I'm honored to be with you, and we have just kind of, given people a sugar high with ice cream. They're about to crash momentarily, so we are fitting into this, narrow window of time when you still have some energy after a very long and, can I say, incredible day. Truly a magic day where we just heard some of the best speeches I have ever heard as regards labor, as regards the condition of the working class, as regards healthcare. And I will say up front, because it's always a good idea to compliment your host or hostess, none of this would have happened without Jane Sanders and her crew at the Sanders Institute. And this is pretty incredible stuff. I am honored to be here because of a vision that Jane and Dave and other people have, which is that you have to have community. You cannot make anything happen on your own. And that's a core message that we'll try to deliver to you today as regards media. Media, unlike all the other issues that have been addressed up to this point, should never be your first issue. Ever. It should never, ever be your first issue. Anybody who says, I'm going to put media concerns ahead of the environment is a fool. Because if you burn a planet, it doesn't matter whether your daily paper arrives, right? Anybody tells you, I think it's more important to worry about the media than it is to worry about wages and whether somebody's living in poverty. That's absurd. No, you have to feed your family. You have to make the basics of your life. Everybody tell you, I think it's more important to worry about the media than it is to worry about the genocide in Gaza. No, that's wrong. You worry first and foremost about these fundamental issues. But media should always be your second issue. It should, no matter what you care about, media should be your second issue. Because the fact of the matter is you'll never get your first issue unless you have a media that provides people with honest information about the circumstances you are addressing. You need media to have democracy, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to make a couple quick remarks up front, then we're going to go to the smart people. And I start out with, I'm cautious about quoting James Madison. He was a very imperfect founder. In fact, when you talk about founders, most of them have deep imperfections. But James Madison was the guy who actually inserted the Bill of Rights into the Constitution, somewhat unwillingly. And about 25 years after the Bill of Rights was put into the Constitution, James Madison was very, very concerned. He's an old guy now. He's worrying about how the Republic was evolving. And he was worried about the infringements on freedom of the press. He was actually worried that the press in the 1820s was becoming somewhat more dysfunctional. And that the great subsidies that they did at the founding of the American experiment to make sure that we had a strong free press. Remember, we funded the mails. You could deliver your media free of charge, essentially, at the founding of the country. We had some of the most massive subsidies ever for any industry for a free and independent and competitive media at the founding of this republic. It was absolutely essential to giving people the information they needed. Madison saw that decaying, and he said this. He said, a popular government without popular information or a means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a tragedy or a farce or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance. A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. We are in a period where our media in this country is in such crisis and such collapse and such dysfunction that it is no longer sufficient to sustain democracy itself. Ignorance is governing knowledge on issue after issue after issue. I don't have to tell you, and I won't belabor it, because you know it. You know that there is an absurdity that we live in a country where people think that billionaires are necessary, but essential workers can be left on the sidelines. Right? The fundamental equations of this country are out of whack because people are not given a sufficient information to deal with the whole reality of what's going on around them. And you can don't blame reporters, don't blame editors. Blame the fact that American media is a system that has experienced a complete collapse of its funding mechanism in our lifetime. It has literally collapsed. And the way that you used to fund newspapers, radio stations, TV stations even, it's gone. It's no longer there. Why? Because you get all your information out of this thing. And it comes to you primarily free. Doesn't necessarily accurate, it isn't necessarily good, but the fact is that the mechanisms are no longer there to sustain journalism. Since 2005, we have lost 45,000 working journalists in this country. We're down 45,000 working journalists. The ratio of replacing journalists from traditional media to new media is you lose 10 from traditional to 1 in new media. New media is not filling the void. So we have a collapse of journalism, we have no filling of the void, and the institutions themselves are collapsing. Since 2005, roughly 20 years, we have lost 1/3 of all print and online publications that existed at that time. Now remember, this is the newspaper and its website. 1/3 of those publications, they're gone, right? And the important thing to understand right now is it's accelerating. We are losing 2.5 newspapers a week, every single week. And a newspaper's not, I'm not some romantic who lives in the past. A newspaper is not, even the solution to our crisis now, except for one thing. It is the newspaper alone that has historically had the vision of a large newsroom, right? That goes out and covers a whole community, that looks at local, state, and national affairs. When you lose that newsroom, whether it's online or in print, it's not replaced. And so we have a democracy crisis in this country that we can trace back almost all of our concerns to this collapse of media. So we're going to talk today a little about this. But before I introduce our incredible panelists and people who are actually trying to solve the problem in fundamental ways, I do want to say one thing. And it's just, at this point, it's become almost the perfunctory anecdote about the sort of, people who brought us together. And back in about 2002, 2003, Bob McChesney and I had written several books on media and democracy. And Bill Moyers, who was just an epic figure, Bill Moyers had put us on TV nationally, and we had actually, started to form a movement around these things, and things were going pretty good. So we came out to Washington for a series of meetings with all sorts of political people, and we even brought Don Henley of the Eagles with us because, we weren't stupid. We knew you'd be a celebrity. And so Don Henley testified before a Senate committee, but it was like everything with the Senate. It was slow, right, and dysfunctional. And we had a meeting at the end of the day arranged with the congressman from Vermont at that time. And you will not have heard of him because obscurity, time passes. He's a guy named Bernie Sanders. And so showing our full respect for Bernie Sanders, we stayed at the Don Henley event, and it ran over and over and over and over. And we're like, come on, senators. And so finally it ends, and we're like, oh my gosh, it's 5:30. We were supposed to meet with Bernie Sanders at like 5 o'clock. We're way late, and because Bernie Sanders is famous for being very patient. And so, and we're like running across Capitol Hill to get to the senator's office. And we get up to the office and say, well, you guys blew it. He's gone. He left. And we're like, damn, that's bad. So we go out, and we're out in front of the office building, and there at the corner, standing at the corner in his like very, sophisticated, very expensive duffel coat, is Bernie Sanders. And we rush up to him, and we say, we know him, and we say, Senator, we're so sorry, we got, hooked up with Don Henley, and we're never, ever going to hang out with rock stars again. And he said, I don't have any time, I'm really in a hurry, I got meetings scheduled, stuff like this. And he says, can we have 2 minutes? And we said, here's what we need. We're going to have a national conference on media reform, and we want you to appear there. We would like to come to Vermont and do a series of events to, focus on media issues, see if we can get people excited about this as an issue. And number 3, we'd like to put a fellow in your office to work on media issues so we can get somebody on Capitol Hill to do all these things. And we said it that fast. And Bernie Sanders says, I'll think about it. And then he headed off on his way. Within a month, we had this Bernie Sanders scheduled to appear as a keynoter at the Media Reform Conference. We had a tour of Vermont that attracted completely packed, filled rooms in Burlington and Montpelier and other places, literally got headline news across Vermont, and we found a basis for building our national movement. And Bernie Sanders brought the best thinker on media, Ben Scott, into his office as a fellow and began to build out the concept of a media reform movement on Capitol Hill, and that came out of 2 minutes with Bernie Sanders. Ladies and gentlemen, I will take 2 minutes of Bernie Sanders over 10 years of anybody else in the United States Congress. So unfortunately, there aren't enough of them, and so we didn't solve all our problems. So we're going to talk today about a couple things that we need to do. Again, I don't want to go on and on about this, a simple concept. We do not have a media today that is sufficient to sustain democracy. and we have to do something about that. The way to do that is not to have just a bunch of legislation per se, although I'll mention a couple things. The way to do that is to have a movement for media reform in this country. It has to be big enough and strong enough that it becomes a part of everything else that we do. So if we're fighting for labor reform, we're also fighting for media reform. If we're fighting for environment, we're fighting for media reform. If we're fighting to end wars, we're fighting for media reform. It's got to be a part of the whole. And that requires two things. One, it does require goals and ideas. We have to have legislation. We have to have things that we do. We have to recognize there is no funding mechanism. No billionaire is going to solve the problem. No foundation is going to solve the problem. It is absurd to wait for some rich guy to come buy something and make that problem go away. It will not happen. Sorry, Josh. My apologies. And so, as a result, there's got to be a government intervention. We've talked about this in housing. We've talked about this in other areas. And the way to do it is to supercharge public broadcasting and community broadcasting across this country so it is fully funded at a level that is equivalent to what we see in every other democracy in the world. And that means you have to increase it, not by double or something like that. We are at the ratio right now to UK, to Canada, places like that, is a 20-to-1 or 40-to-1 ratio. We are so underfunded in our public media in this country that we don't begin to build it out at the level that other countries do, and it has a profound impact. So we have to do that. Number two, we have to create a tax credit so that every American can deduct $250 from their taxes for subscriptions and media that they support. That means that if you're running a website, if you're creating a newspaper, you're doing a radio, whatever, you get to write that off your taxes. You say to me, Mr. Nichols, come on, another tax credit? That's just ridiculous. Well, you know who gets to write off their subscriptions? You know who gets to write off their media? Billionaires. It's a business expense to get the Wall Street Journal or Barron's or something like that. But we don't have a democracy expense in this country to write off a vehicle by which you can get the information so you can govern your own affairs. So brothers and sisters, a couple simple pieces of legislation. Yes, we need to do that. But then there's the second part of it. We have to create a media in this country that even in this terrible, dysfunctional, underfunded moment shows us the models for what we're going to do going forward. And that is why we have two of the literal best people in the country to talk about this issue. And they're, I know. I'm like. And we're going to use them to talk about the crisis, but also talk about what you do. Because the fact is, when I say we need to be able to give $250 to something we want to support, right, write it off our taxes as they do in other countries, these are examples of what, not necessarily the only thing, but some things that we might want to talk about. So first I'm going to introduce, I think I'm going to start with John, if that's okay. I mean, we could go either way here. I'm closer. Yeah, you're closer. Yeah. John Quayle, who's, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't get your information from Common Dreams, you are misinformed, underinformed, and ill-informed. Common Dreams, yes. Common Dreams is a website that's been around forever, right? And well, since the 90s. Late 90s. I became familiar with it because they used to aggregate stuff, and I was in Seattle at the great protests against the WTO, and somebody said, I read your stuff every day. And I said, well, how do you do that? You live in, California. And he said, I read it on Common Dreams. And that was my introduction, and I began to realize the power of this incredibly low budget, right? Small operation that has enormous reach. And what John has done, along with his great staffers that are with him today, is to build out a model for how you do serious coverage of national and international affairs on fundamental issues like Gaza, like war and peace, like poverty, like labor organizing, with a small staff, but one that has immense reach and takes in and amplifies so many voices. So ladies and gentlemen, please give the biggest round of applause you have ever given to John Quayle as we listen to some of his remarks here. I'll come sit with you out here and then.
You come sit. I'll sit. I'll sit if that's all right, Dave.
Sit. Okay.
Sit. Thank you, John. That's very kind. And I will only say that having Warren Gunnels stand up, just even for a moment, I'll never forget it.
Well, now hold it. I think we should point out that the most successful media creator in the room is, in fact, Warren Gunnels. Twitter star Warren Gunnels. Yeah.
We've written many headlines based on one tweet alone from Mr. Gunnels. But that's a very kind introduction. Again, John, thank you. And he's been a great supporter and contributor over the years. And it's an honor to be on the stage with David as well. And I only would say the origin story of Common Dreams is good. First of all, and it's important, I think, a little bit to the narrative and the discussion we can have about Common Dreams was started in 1997 by Craig Brown and his late wife, Lina Newhouser, both in their own right, amazing organizers and activists who worked on political campaigns, worked on anti-nuclear efforts, worked in grassroots movements in the Northeast and in Appalachia, and of course, another power couple. We lost Lina in 2008, but Craig and Lina built Common Dreams, you know, from a vision recognizing, or what John's talking about, that the existing media wasn't serving democracy, wasn't serving working people, wasn't serving the issues. So if you look out and you have a critique of corporate media and mainstream media, you know, the logical question is, how do you do it differently? What does it look like? What can it can be? And in the late 90s, right, it's the end of the Clinton era, but it's also the rise of the internet, which was at nascent stages. And so, as John referenced, the initial version of Common Dreams came out of Craig's work in Washington. He was chief of staff to former Congressman Tom Andrews from Maine. And he, as a chief of staff, would do clippings, right, for the office. This is for staff. These are the news headlines that I needed to know day to day. These are the op-eds I want people to read. These are the headlines that are important. And Craig was always a news junkie, and Lina was, you know, again, always dedicated to that bigger mission. So the Common Dreams came out at, again, the very early stages of the internet as more of an aggregate model, giving, you know, bringing pieces together, mainstream outlets, far-flung local newspapers, and putting it in one place as a way to highlight what was good. Because there's always been, even in the corporate media, there's great reporters, great journalism being done, but, you know, the average person can't read all that content. So bringing that stuff together, but curating it in a way with a vision that's different, an editorial vision that's quite distinct from a corporate model where, you know, those decisions that get made about what's on the front page, what's highlighted, what's on page 17, you know, those decisions in a newsroom mean everything about what gets left off, who is quoted, what issues are centered, which issues are ignored. And so right then, just starting to make those decisions differently changes everything about how journalism is done. And so the evolution of, when I joined Common Dreams in 2007, which was a lifetime ago, as Dave and I were talking about, you know, it was also a different world. The internet was coming up, more websites, more competition, nascent social media, but the mission of Common Dreams is very simple, and it's always been the same, even though things have changed so much in the landscape. But the mission is to inform, to inspire, to ignite change for the common good. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We're actually not necessarily a news organization. We're an organization that has that mission, and we have chosen to do news reporting and media work to fulfill that mission. And there's lots of other ways to do it. But what we realize is that, you know, with a team of dedicated journalists, my colleagues who are here, Julia Conley and Jessica Corbett, who will hopefully haggle you for interviews, and please chat with them if they ask you. If you have the capacity to hire dedicated quality journalists and you unleash them from a corporate model, they can do amazing work. And you know, John and David have shown that throughout their careers. There are so many journalists, and if you talk to journalists who work in the corporate newsrooms in the corporate world, and they feel shackled, you know, by the constraints of the editorial model or who the owners are, even if owners aren't interfering in their day-to-day decisions, we know how that stuff moves and works its way down. And again, Common Dreams just built on a different model, what it looks like, what it can look like if you unshackle those. And you have staff who, you don't ask them to check their politics at the door, you don't ask them to leave their hearts at the door, or how they care about the planet at the door. There's a different kind of journalism that can be done when you, again, untether good journalists, again, who care about their craft, who are dedicated to facts and knowledge and are smart and intelligent, but also have a real dedication to the common good. Like, it doesn't need to be expensive. Good, deep journalism it has a price, but just let good journalists do good work with, again, a mission that is larger than profits, and I think, amazing things can happen. I think we've been a model for what's possible, but we are by no means the solution, or we can't fill all those gaps. So to John's point about what's needed is something so much bigger and grander than what we can do. And we lean so much on John's work and on the work of other journalists and the work David does and Warren Gunnell's tweets and Sarah Nelson's tweets.
Yes.
And Bernie.
Yes.
But so that's just, I guess, a starting point about what we've tried to do over the last 25 years at Common Dreams and my time there. Again, I feel really blessed to be able to do the work, but it's, there's a limit to what it can do, and we can talk more about
So let's
that.
follow up for a second, and then we're going to go to David. But, I mean, I don't want any proprietary secrets here, but what's your traffic? Roughly, what do you...
I mean, we have millions of, our monthly traffic is in the millions. It has been, and these things go up and down, as you know. So we have a very robust readership and have very dedicated readership. And as we go through cycles and go up and down, but we've never laid off a journalist.
Which makes you completely different than almost all media.
But that means we are small. We run a tight ship. We have a small budget. We are funded by our readers. We're not a subscription model, so all our content is Creative Commons published. It's free to take and steal and republish anywhere you want. So that when the media is paid for, right, we pay our staff, we give them health benefits, and we let them do the work. And then the work is, there's no ads on our site. There's no paywall.
It's amazing.
And it took time to build that, to be able to do that. And that's all, 90% of our funding, if not more, is from our reader base. Again, it's not a subscription model, it's a donation model. So we run, campaigns asking for donations.
You beg.
We beg and we plead, and we are alarmist. Yes.
I hate to tell you, you are alarmist, yes. It's disgusting. But, and this is the scary part, what percentage of your readers actually give?
Less than 1%.
99% of the people are, they get in the car, they're taking the ride across the country. When it comes time to pay for gas, they're not paying for gas.
Yeah.
So 1%. Now, what would happen if we had a system where people could write off a donation? Like if they could write off saying, giving you $200 a year. If 1 million people could give you $200 a year, what might that mean for Common Dreams?
Well, I would have flown here.
With Sarah Nelson.
Happily. But we had a nice drive. We say that, it doesn't, again.
Think about it, though.
Yeah. That's a game changer. Being able, as a 501c3, so people can write off their donations, that's fine. But having a dedicated public source of money that people can, support, and we get, and the Sanders campaign and team knows this well. Like we've existed on a small dollar model forever, right? And the technology has gotten better, and actually the 2016 and the 2020 campaign showed the potential of what you can do on the small dollar model. But we've always been built on that, which makes us very resilient. But it also it inherently makes us cautious. We've never fired anyone or laid anyone off. Man, we fired some. But we never had those layoffs. But it doesn't mean that we didn't grow the way we wanted to, that we didn't, hold off on hiring, that we didn't not make investments that we wanted to make or do new projects or do more work or bring on more people. So we've always been held back by resources, and that just comes with the territory. And we don't need to be enormous. Anyone can have a big vision about what's necessary. We don't need a conglomerate, Common Dreams. We don't need a bigger nation. We need to be safe. We need to be able to scale when we think we can. So the funding is always the issue about what we're able to. Oh, I wish we could do more. We're happy that we can do what we do. We do as much as we can. But of course, it always holds us back about what's possible.
And we need more. We need, not because I like you, but because we need a bigger Common Dreams. We also need more Common Dreams. We need more of this to begin to fill the void as regards journalism in this country.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think, yeah, and we need more of us doing, we do what we do as best we can. But I look out, again, let me just credit to Lever and David. One thing we've said that Craig has said in many recent years is like, if we were trying to start Common Dreams now, it would be very difficult to do so. In fact, I don't think we could, right? So we've had the benefit of that, and we've had very loyal donors and supporters, Bill Moyers and others, and just great champions over these decades. And you build trust, and that's worth something, but it's hard to build something from scratch. But I want to give a lot of credit to David Sirota, who has been building something from scratch in recent years in a situation that is not friendly. So I think what the Lever's doing is amazing. And again, he's not alone. So many different talented, excellent efforts out there. You see some surviving, but you've seen a lot crash and burn and die. Not because they did anything wrong, because the resources aren't there, the audience isn't there, and everyone has been undercut by tech and social media, and those revenue streams are gone. And then you have, again, you can't subscribe to every magazine, you can't support every media outlet or every good cause. So everyone is fighting for those resources. So again, when it comes to those shift in models, it's not working, it's not enough, and the system overall, it's broken. And we're not here to be, I'm not optimistic on that front. I think it's okay to say that we are in a real crisis of journalism, as John laid out with the figures and the numbers. Common Dreams we don't cover state politics. We can't get into state houses, not with the resources we have. So many of those things go uncovered. So many of the stories I've heard this weekend, that's a story, I want to talk to that person, I want to write that story. We can't. So there's no way, even with the dedicated staff that we have, or that David has, or even the nation has, there's not enough resources to do that storytelling.
So we got to scale it up. Need more Common Dreams. And the guy's a genius, right? Totally sets up the other panelists. Brilliant job there, by the way. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I said you want a loud round of applause at the start, but a much bigger round of applause for John Kennedy. Hey, David Sirota, no one here knows you. But no, David did, he came up the honorable way as an aide on Capitol Hill and in politics, and proved to be one of the more brilliant thinkers about how to communicate about politics as a aide to members of Congress, even a senator now and again, and actually was very active in the Sanders for President campaign along the way, but decided to try journalism. Right? You've done it for a long time. You've been in and out. You wrote some best-selling books and things of that nature. But you decided to try and actually, in this moment, to create a media platform. And that's just stupid. Right? I mean, that's crazy. No one can do that. And yet, not only have you done it, you are now writing and producing award-winning journalism that is driving major media to try and catch up with you. How did you do that, David Sirota? Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for David Sirota before he tells us all sorts of really cool things.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. I'm a fan of these two people, and I'm a fan of so many of you here, and I really appreciate the invite. After the 2020 campaign, I decided I wanted to go back to journalism. I've been working as a full-time reporter. I was at Newsweek and International Business Times. I was working for a place called Capital in Maine. And in that experience, I had decided that what I wanted to try to do was not, I didn't want to be necessarily in the amplification game anymore. I wanted to be in the news breaking game, to actually report out original stories that were not being reported. And that is the most expensive form of journalism. The most expensive form of journalism is to actually go out and find things that other people are not reporting on and actually elevate them in a way that they make impact. And that is what we focus on at The Lever every single day. We pick our stories very carefully. We spend time trying to report stories that can add to the discourse in a way that can actually change the discourse. And I think I can give you plenty of examples. My favorite example was, I think, during the horrible East Palestine derailment. That horrible situation happened, and we broke open a story that looked back at what were the decisions on specific policies that were made to create the environment for a disaster like that to happen, and which politicians took money at the time while they were making those decisions. And in doing that reporting, it elevated it to a point in the national conversation. Other media outlets, big outlets, followed us in asking, well, if those conditions were created and those decisions were made, what different kinds of decisions can be made now? And ultimately, our reporting ended up playing a big role in getting the Senate and the House to introduce major rail safety legislation that had specific provisions in it that dealt with exactly what we were reporting on. So that was like a big success story. Now, the reason I tell that story is because that's what we aim to do every day. And the way I think that happened was with a focus on reporting out stories that could take a conversation that was already happening and add new information to it. Information that would not have been surfaced, would not have been part of the conversation had our reporters not done that. And the purpose of it is not just to have the information out there. I mean, they at one point, the New York Times asked us to do a full-page op-ed about our reporting. I mean, that's how elevated it became. The reason to do that is not, for our own glory. It's that ultimately to shape what actually happens moving forward. So our goal is to hold accountable those who are making these decisions with the hope that if they are held accountable, they will be deterred from making such bad decisions in the future. The challenge in this work to actually fund it is to convince enough people who are reading to pitch in a little bit to help us do what we're doing and do more. It is, in a sense, the same challenge of a political campaign. When Bernie Sanders ran for president, you're talking hopefully to 250 million people, but you need a subset of those people to pitch in a little bit. Right now we have a media in this country where there's a few people who fund lots of the media. What we actually need is a media where lots of people pitch in a little bit to fund media. So changing that paradigm is what we do. We are a reader-supported media entity. So I don't make any, I'm not bashful about asking our readers, pitch in a little bit to help us grow this newsroom. And here are the results of what happens when you pitch in. And I think that model, I don't know how far it can go, but I know that, here's what I do know, is that any media entities today that are not focused on doing that will either only be corporate or billionaire-owned media, or they will not last very long. So part of the challenge is to always keep your eye on the idea that if you're not funding that, if you're not asking people to pitch in a little bit, then you're not going to be sustainable for the long haul. And the difficulty is, obviously, is that a lot of people hate media right now. But I would also argue that that's an opportunity, that the loss of trust in media, in corporate, billionaire-owned media, first and foremost is legitimate. I think people have lost trust because they see a media that is talking about things that have nothing to do with their daily lives. You'll notice if you go read our site, I would say all of our coverage is centrally, and it's not about money and politics, although it is. It's about the issues that actually people are dealing with on a daily basis. And I think the loss of trust in corporate media has to do with the fact that corporate media really, in lots of ways, isn't even trying to talk about those issues. So that's an opportunity, I think, for independent media. And I think the trick is going to be how quickly can you scale it up? I think that what we have done, and I'm not trying to pat ourselves on the back, but we and others have done, is shown that, listen, we can produce high-quality, credible journalism that surfaces new facts and forces the entire corporate media space and the political space to actually take our reporting seriously and have to deal with it. So proof of concept, that's a huge thing. Now it's How do we get the resources to scale up? And that's the central question. And the problem is, I will just be frank about it. There's no quick answer. There's no shortcut here. I feel like everybody in the media space is looking for a shortcut, like a quick answer, and what you learn in doing this, the billionaire. And I should say, it's not to say that those with resources can't help. I think this is sort of a portfolio model. Like there are models where you say, listen, I'm going to get mostly reader supported, then I'm going to get some foundation, then I'm going to get, right? It's a pie chart, right? Any of it takes time. There's no quick answer. I wish there was. I've been looking for one. There is no quick answer. But I don't think that's a pessimistic message. I think what's optimistic is if the lever, as an example, as a small 12, 13, 14, 15 person entity can break, for instance, and this is one example, a big story in one of the biggest disasters in this country that happened, and actually get the Congress to have to deal with it. Actually get the New York Times to call us up and say, we want a full-page editorial op-ed about summarizing everything that you've reported. If one entity can do that, then it's really just a matter of how do you scale that up.
Mm-hmm. David Sirota saying smart stuff here. David, you're doing this, and you pick places around the country. You pick East Palestine and spots like that, but you are a national entity. I'm sort of, just throwing softball here, but isn't one of the real crises that we've seen almost a complete collapse of investigative reporting at the local level, right? Even in big cities like New York, Los Angeles, places across this country, you've been able to pull together and get resources to do it at the national level, but could you do this in a community, in one community, or do you think it would work?
I absolutely think you could. There are various examples of it, nascent examples of it happening. I think, again, the trick is, I think what's even harder at the local level is media has been so nationalized.
That's right.
That what people conceive of as media, or at least news media, what people conceive of as politics is now national in nature. I mean, as I said, I think lots of people may know who their U.S. senator is. Lots and lots and lots and lots of people have no idea who their state representative is,
or their city council person is.
And that is not because people are stupid. It's because when people tune in, whatever time they have to tune into media, they are told over and over again, the only thing that politics is this thing that happens very far away that has really nothing to do with their lives. So I think the challenge for local media is if you need to build a local readership, if you need to build, and part of that readership is willing to pitch in a little bit. Mm-hmm. You've got to get a local readership that understands that, first and foremost, there is local politics. Mm-hmm. There is local news. So that's a difficult challenge, but I know that I can tell you, I live in Denver. I can tell you there are organizations in Denver. The Denver Post has collapsed, just like the Burlington Free Press here has collapsed, right? There is a vacuum that various entities are trying to fill. I don't know if those experiments will be successful, but I think, just to reiterate, I sound like a broken record, it's to go back to, can we actually slowly but surely create a culture in this country that says pitching in a little bit to journalism at whatever level is something that is worthwhile? Mm-hmm. And that right now, that's a hard question to answer, but if we can crack that, I think we can crack it all.
David Sirota. Jane Sanders is giving, how many did you give me there? She gave me 7 minutes. This is astounding, amazing. How badly has major media screwed up on coverage of Gaza? John?
No, plenty. Well, I'll say one thing. I had a long addiction years ago to AM radio just because I thought, it was so valuable, and to know what that echo chamber sounded like. So just as someone to be informed, to recognize, knowing your enemy and recognizing, like John's colleague and Bob McChesney, who had a big influence on me years ago, making some of those connections about, beyond Chomsky and everything else, but starting to understand how the media was really working. But listening to right-wing AM radio and, of course, Fox, and realizing and recognizing how insidious and how pervasive, corporate media had become in selecting the agenda, targeting people, propagandizing, and then, of course, it's a slower burn to realize how insidious, liberal corporate media can be, and then recognizing just the amount of just energy that is pushed on cable news and in dominant newspaper markets. Again, this cheapening of a national news narrative about what's acceptable, what's inside the framework. And yeah, the situation in Gaza, I think, exemplifies how horrible, a corporate liberal media gets that story, because it's so constrained by what's been allowed to be discussed, what terms are allowed to be used, what images are allowed to be shown, and how it contextualizes, how it tells history, who's allowed to be an enemy and who's not, who's allowed to be a victim and who's not. So, I mean, from my, again, origin story, I mean, I was a Common Dreams reader before I ever thought about working there, and that was during, post 9/11 years and the Iraq War, where Common Dreams was, was organizing and sort of operating as an activist and just an engaged person who was furious about the situation. And Common Dreams became this place where, I could find out a narrative that was different from, if you wake up every morning, you watch Fox News, that impacts you, obviously. And if there's this other alternative, like, well, I'm not hearing that every night. So that goes back a long way in terms of just cracking dominant narratives on a daily basis, which is a lot of what we try to do. I mean, we are, Common Dreams, a little bit, I don't bill ourselves as an investigative news outlet. It's not what we're good at, it's not what we're built for. I would love to have an investigative division. And because I think the work that David has shown and just talked about is so vital. But there is this other important thing about just reframing stories and elevating different kinds of voices that I think is a little bit more of what we're good at Common Dreams every day, is offering a daily front page of a news selection. These are the stories we think you should look at, and the stories that everyone else is talking about, there's a different way to talk about them. There's a different avenue into that story. Instead of the buried quote in paragraph 12, that's the lead. And so when it comes to, pick your story. I mean, Gaza has been heartbreaking at any journalist who's covered it, and I cover it from, 5,000 miles away. It just breaks your heart every day. So, and that's, again, it's horrible to sit in a remote office, which Common Dreams now remote. We used to have a beautiful brick and mortar newsroom. All of us in our own offices, safe and sound. But journalists in Gaza and Palestine right now
are risking their
every single day. And so the journalism that those folks are doing, the Palestinian journalists, and that make our work possible, just to do a little better storytelling, just to focus a little bit on the human tragedy of that, so there's no contest there for how we do it at Common Dreams. But again, elevating those voices, giving people a different perspective on what's happening on the ground, that we hope that has value for people. So that's, again, pick your issue, but that's what we try to do every day, is just to reorientate the frame around labor, around climate. What's the top story today? Yeah, India, like Bill McKibben said last night, 126 degrees Fahrenheit this week. And that's not, check your phone, check your favorite source right now. That is not the top headline at CNN. It's not the top headline at New York Times. And if Gaza is the top headline right now, look at what it is. It's probably not what it should be. And that's not, again, amazing journalists work at all those outlets. That's not a rebuke of individual journalists, or it's just recognizing the constraints of those outlets and the limits of those models, I think. So does that answer your question?
Yes. David, we're in the midst of a presidential campaign. What's the media getting? What's and we think of a media system, not individual outlets that are doing a great job, but overall, how's the media doing covering this presidential campaign?
I think it's very difficult to find new things to say about candidates that people perceive they know every single thing about and have heard every single thing about. I think the most valuable coverage that can be done is to try to explain the implications of what each candidate's victory will mean in a detailed way. I think letting people know over and over again, this is likely to be what happens in the real world if candidate A wins. This is likely to be what happens in the real world if candidate B wins for your life, I think is the thing that is not breaking through. It's not getting through. It's not really the center at all of the coverage at all. And I think that's, frankly, it's really terrifying because ultimately there will be this election amid all this nonsensical discourse. There will be an election that will have real life consequences for all of us in this room and everybody outside this room. And that's not really what's centered in the coverage. And you know, frankly, I do think, having worked in some of these newsrooms, I do think part of the reason it's not is because, again, I go back to this idea that I think people perceive that they've already heard everything that there can be to say about the two candidates. They are such familiar candidates, they're actually bad topics for news. Mm-hmm. Because they're overexposed, right? Mm-hmm. They're like overexposed celebrities, mm-hmm. right? At this point, or at least that's what they are in the media space. So how do you make overexposed celebrities more interesting on a daily basis? Well, the easiest thing to do is come up with something even more outrageous about them. The harder thing to do is to make compelling the story of what they will actually do if they are in this office, what they will actually do in people's daily lives. That's a much harder thing. It requires more work, it requires more resources, it requires more reporting, it requires more storytelling talent. But that's actually what needs to be done.
David Sirota is right, ladies and gentlemen. Another round of applause for him. And Nation Magazine doing a full issue on Project 2025, looking at what the Trump administration were to come to pass would mean, and going issue by issue with, I believe, even Bill McKibben writing our section on what it would mean for the environment. Good. So if you're not a subscriber, blah, 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 promotion. But you should also be a big consumer of Common Dreams. If you're not reading Common Dreams and supporting it, you're making a mistake for yourself. If you're not reading and supporting The Lever, you're making a mistake. And let me close off by just saying a simple thing. I tweet quite often. And some people, literally, Sarah Nelson in this room just went, no shit. And because I DM what I think are good stories to Sarah Nelson. Because Sarah Nelson's got a different group of people following her. And I'm just going to tell you, this is a little hack on our current media system. If you've got a piece of good journalism, get it to somebody who's interested in it so they can amplify it. And one of the best amplifiers in America is Sarah Nelson, who doesn't just think about herself, but also gets the messages out about other causes and other issues. She is a model for how to do it, and she is a hero because she actually recognizes the media doesn't just stop with her. It actually starts with her. She is producing media as well. You should give her round of applause. And you should also recognize Wendell Potter, because Wendell Potter has actually created Healthcare Uncovered, which digs into how to tell the healthcare story better. And this guy, he has crashed and burned and tried things before. He doesn't always succeed, but Wendell Potter goes back at it, and he is now succeeding with Healthcare Uncovered, one of the great vehicles by which to get these stories out. And you need to be paying attention to him and the work he is doing. Alan Minsky reminds us that there is a bill in Congress to actually create a federal writers project to fund journalism right now. Representative Lieu and others, we ought to be backing that bill and talking about it. And that's why Alan Minsky's so useful, because he keeps pointing out things and vehicles to do stuff. And let me close off here by doing something that's already been done, and because there's nothing more important than repeating what's already been done. And that is to say, I've covered stuff for a very long time, done a lot of journalism. I think Bernie Sanders has been an awfully incredibly helpful person. He is useful to me, not as like an interesting guy or something like that. He's useful because he actually talks about issues that just about everybody else neglects. And the fact of the matter is that if we didn't have a Bernie Sanders, we'd have to create him, because you got to have somebody in the Senate who actually says, well, this is important too. And he's just been an epic hero in that regard. And another epic hero sitting 2 rows behind him is somebody who was mentioned the other night, and that's Jim Zogby. Jim Zogby has been out there trying to raise issues of peace in the Middle East for Israel and Palestine, for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, recognizing the whole of the challenge in that region. And Jim Zogby can tell you about being standing in front of the White House with 50 other people trying to raise these issues. He has been absolutely at the center of it. And one of the things that is so great about Jim Zogby is that in addition to all his activism, he maintains a steady media critique. He looks at what the New York Times is doing, and if they get it right, he compliments them. But boy, if they get it wrong, he calls them out. And the fact is, as much as everything else that we do, organizing to create great new media, fighting to have legislation that might actually get us resources for media, media criticism matters because it shames media when it fails us, and there is simply no one who has been more consistent on that, on fundamental issues of peace and justice in this world, than Jim Zogby. He is an absolute hero. And let us close with a round of applause for these guys, with a round of applause for all the people we mentioned, and especially for our friend Jim Zogby. Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you. Now, what we're going to do now is have Stephanie Kelton come up and introduce her film that we are going to move into the auditorium to hear and to watch immediately thereafter. So Stephanie Kelton is a professor at Stony Brook. She's a Sanders Institute Fellow and a wonderful human being and very talented. So thank you for coming. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Jane and Dave and Bernie. It is so nice to be back in Burlington for a second, and I hope second of many to come, gatherings of this kind. We've heard some electric speakers today, yes? Electrifying. I was going to be electrifying. And then Sarah Nelson gave me a Benadryl to help with my allergies. And now I'm going to go take a nap. So look, this is great. I love this because I feel like I'm at home when I come into a room filled with people like you, big thinkers. When I worked briefly for Senator Sanders in the Senate, I remember he would come in, we would have staff meetings, he would sit down, and he would always start by asking the staffers, what should we be doing? What should we be doing? He wanted to hear from us, and then he would say, I want you to think big, not small. People were suffering, people are suffering, and he was so intensely sensitive to the suffering going on across this country and around the world. And he didn't want us to tinker at the edges and nibble away at the problem in ways that would make life less bad for people. He wanted real improvements, material improvements in people's lives. And I had so much respect for that, and I have enormous respect for the people who come to gatherings like this to bring their big ideas, to share thoughts about what we can do to make meaningful change in this country. And so, I am in this fight with you, both as an academic, writing about things like poverty, inequality, Social Security, joblessness, the climate, the Federal Reserve, fiscal policy. But I'm also something of an agitator. And I hope that that will come through when we get an opportunity, and I hope you'll join us and go next door for this documentary, because when I look at the problems that we're facing and I ask myself, what can I bring to the fight, right? What can I contribute? What can I offer? I think because of my training as a macroeconomist and with expertise in finance and the monetary system and those sorts of things, these are issues of such importance, but so many people don't understand them. It seems too complicated. We've heard, and we talked just now about the media and the role of the media, and I'll say it, I think the population has been indoctrinated. I think we've been misinformed, ill-informed, lied to about what our capacity to do in terms of Congress, federal legislation, fiscal policy, the F word that for too long we put in the box, and we didn't talk about fiscal policy. We just said it's the Federal Reserve's job. It's monetary policy. Whatever goes wrong in the economy, the Federal Reserve is supposed to fix it. Unemployment, inflation, maintaining a healthy labor market, and so forth. I think monetary policy is the weak tea. It is the weakest tool, and it probably doesn't work the way they think it works. The powerful tool is fiscal policy, and we've got to get comfortable with the idea of using the F word again. And I think COVID did so much to remind us of the relative power of monetary and fiscal policies. Fiscal policy is where it is at. Remember the Great Recession, the financial crisis, the implosion of the housing market with the subprime mortgages and all of the fraud that ran through the system. That was a crisis. The downturn was as severe as anything we had experienced since the Great Depression. We lost about 9 million jobs. It took roughly 7 years to claw them all back. We got scared of the F word, of fiscal policy. We saw the deficit increase. The national media told us we had a debt crisis. We were going to end up like Greece. We were burdening future generations. The grandchildren would have a heavy bill to pay because of the spending that was done to deal in part with the crisis. But we didn't deal with the crisis. We got the Simpson-Bowles Commission, the Cat Food Commission, as I like to call it, that would have cut Social Security, Medicare, the sequester with the caps on spending. We had a very anemic recovery that didn't feel like a recovery for millions and millions of people. When the jobs finally came back, we know now that they were inferior to the jobs that were lost. In almost every single case, as the jobs were restored, they were lower wage and lower hour jobs. People were worse off, not better off, as the jobs came back. And when Barack Obama was asked, well, how are we going to deal with rescuing the economy, shoring up people's lives and livelihoods? Can we afford it? He said, and I quote, "We're out of money. We're out of money." That was at the start of his first term in office. And it was like a punch in the gut for me because I knew how wrong that was. We were not out of money. We get Donald Trump, right? After Obama's 8 years, we get Donald Trump as president. What do the Republicans come in and do? Cut taxes. They don't care about the fiscal or budgetary impacts. They want to pass their agenda. So we get sweeping tax cuts. CBO says the tax cuts will add $1.9 trillion to the deficit. Republicans shrug and say, who cares? On the other side of the government deficit lies a financial windfall for somebody else. Every deficit is good for someone. The question is for whom and for what, right? And that's something that the media doesn't remind us of. And so I would hope that we can learn that lesson. So move on from Donald Trump. Here comes COVID. We've been told that because of the Republican tax cuts, there won't be any money to do anything if we face a crisis in the future. If the economy slows down, if there's a war, there's no money because the Republicans let it all go with their tax cuts. Big lie, huge lie, repeated by many Democrats, including former Treasury secretaries. Well, how do we know it was a lie? Because COVID happened. And when COVID happened, Donald Trump is president, Democrats have the House, Republicans have the Senate, and what do? March of 2020, a $2.2 trillion fiscal package called the CARES Act. Sent money to most families in this country. Unemployment benefits at $600 a week, $2,400 a month. Some people in this country, millions in fact, had more money unemployed than they ever had working in their lives. Many, for the first time, reached the end of the month with money left in the bank. They were able to save something for the first time in their lives. Fiscal policy. Months later, in December, a $900 billion fiscal package, followed in March of 2021, Democrats only passing the American Rescue Plan Act, $1.9 trillion. Add those three numbers together, what do you get? $5 trillion going out the door in 12 months' time. Incredible. We cut child poverty by roughly 40%, and you can talk on and on about the benefits, because every deficit is good for someone. The question is for whom, and where does the windfall on the other side of the government deficit go? In March of 2021, it went to the bottom 99% of people living in this country. That's who it helped. The Republicans did $1.9 trillion with their tax cuts. Where did it go? 83% of the benefits went to people in the top 1% of the income distribution. It's not about the deficit and whether you have it or don't have it. Every deficit is good for someone. Who benefits, and what are those deficits being used to accomplish? Now we're using the deficit to do infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, the biggest climate legislation we've ever had. All three pieces of legislation are powering this economy forward. Is it working for everyone? No. And we spent the whole day talking about acute problems in this economy, in housing, in healthcare, and everything else. Is it working for everyone? No. But is there a better tool to deploy in the interest of rebuilding, repairing this economy and creating one that works for everyone? No, there is not. There is no alternative to using fiscal policy. And so I ended up being the subject of a documentary. I didn't realize it at the time. I was just asked to sit for a few interviews, which I agreed to do. I didn't know, and maybe the filmmaker didn't know either, that she would end up putting together a film that revolved largely around my intellectual journey, because it took me a while to arrive at the place where I understood things the way I do today. And so I invite you to go next door, where the director of the film has a short video. Her name is Maren Poitras. She's going to introduce the film. And then I feel really happy and privileged to be joined for the Q&A by Josh Farley, who's a professor here at the University of Vermont, professor of ecological economics. So all of the hard questions go to him. And I would love to walk next door with you and watch the film. Thank you so much.
Right now, millions of people are getting robbed, and not by the guys you might think, but by hospital and insurance company executives. They crooks, because they manage to hide hospital prices from all of us. When we can't see or compare prices, hospitals charge us whatever they want. They robbing us. It's corporate greed. It's not even legal, but nobody's enforcing that law.